In this 3-hour course, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Xfer Serum. It's the ultimate synth for electronic music production, and we're going to go deep into oscillators, filters, effects, modulation, and much more so you can hop into the synth, feel confident to tweak any preset or make any sound that you want to. With that, let's hop straight into it. Okay, so this isn't going to be a tutorial on how to install Serum, so if you want that, I would just quickly go Google how to install it on your Mac or PC for your DAW. Once you have got Serum installed in your DAW, load it up onto a new MIDI or instrument channel, and you will get presented with this interface. Now, it looks super confusing, especially if you're brand new to Serum. So what we're going to first do is just provide a general overview of all of the sections in Serum, just so you feel at ease. Now, it absolutely helps to have some high quality presets to use with Serum. So I'm just going to give a quick shout to our EDMProd EDM Essentials pack, which is a bunch of great sounds for all different genres of electronic dance music. You've got sounds like this, and this, and even this. So go check it out for free down below in the description, load it up into Serum and go nuts. So the first thing we have to understand is that Serum is split into 3 sections. We've got this top toolbar, we've got this main section, which is this light gray here, and then this dark gray is the modulation section, right? And so this selector between the 4 buttons at the top here changes this light gray section. So we've got the oscillator section by default, the effects section as well, the matrix, and the global. As you see, the bottom stays the same no matter which one of these 4 we are on. Now, starting with the top left, if you click on the Serum icon, you can change the size of Serum. I have it a little bit bigger, set to 122% here. You can also, instead of using these preset percentages, actually use the bottom right-hand side here and scale it up or down. I like to use that personally. You can also load up third-party skins. We'll cover that later in the tutorial and in the masterclass because it's a bit of an advanced setting, but it is cool to have different skins that you can swap between. You can download these from a variety of websites. Some of them look really cool. Some of them are more crazy like this one. Let's go back to default for now. That is that menu there. That's pretty much everything. You can also go back to a default 100% zoom if you prefer. Up the top here, you've got your preset folder selector. Now, basically, we'll cover presets in a second, but this is where you can load up sounds that just sound good from the get-go. As you can see, there's a ton of different folders here. Serum has a bunch of included presets, as you've probably seen. Like, for example, the bass and bass hard folders are default Serum folders. I've added a bunch of my own third-party ones in here, so don't worry if it doesn't look 100% the same as mine. Now, if you're working on any preset or any sound, you can save whatever you're working on with this quick floppy disk icon. There's actually a user folder made for you. It actually has a save your presets here.txt. So if anything we're working on, we can save it in that user folder, which is pretty cool. What you can also do, instead of having to navigate to presets through here, you can also use these 2 icons. We also have a dedicated preset browser here as well. This allows you to see all of your presets in one menu. Now, some of the default Serum presets actually have categories attached to them. It has the date information on when it was created, and you can actually filter by different types of presets, which is a pretty cool feature. Again, some of them will have no category. This is generally true of ones that you may download from third-party sample or preset packs. The other thing that changes when you're on this preset browser menu is that the 4 macros, which we'll cover again later down in this masterclass, will appear at the top. So that's just one thing to note down there. As you can see, if you go out of them, they are down here in the bottom left-hand side of Serum. The menu here is a bunch of different helpful things that you'll need to know when navigating through Serum. You've got your standard about, which obviously just shows you some stuff about Serum if you're interested. We can actually click X out of there. We can read the manual, which opens up the PDF manual in a new PDF viewer, whatever your computer uses. Very helpful to refer to the manual when you're working in Serum because there may be features that even in this masterclass I don't get to cover because they may be released after you're seeing this. So Serum always has new features coming out. So always reference the manual there. Speaking of new versions of Serum, you can also check for updates. Clicking that will make sure that you're on the latest version, no matter whether you purchased it directly from Xfer Records or whether you got it on something like Splice. Okay. You can also load a preset directly from a folder by clicking the load preset. This is good if you've got your pack located outside of Serum's default presets folder on your computer. Very helpful. I'm actually going to use this init preset. This means initialize preset. Takes us back to the default state that Serum has when you first load it up. So if you've gone and loaded up a preset and you want to go back to normal, init preset is your friend. You're going to be reaching for that a lot. You can also init a bunch of other things. You can init the modulations. Which basically means any movement we're adding to the sound, we will be able to initialize those. Same with LFOs in particular, which is not including the envelopes here. Again, we'll cover what that is in a second. Then also you can revert to saved, which basically means if I load up a preset, by the way, if you do make changes to any sound and then move to another preset, it will give you this warning menu. So let's say we got this sound here, which is one I designed. If I make a change, let's say I change the wavetable here, and I wanted to go back to the original version, I can just go revert to saved, and it will change anything I've done on that preset there, so we go back to what it was like. Very helpful if you're messing around with tweaking presets to make them your own, but you end up in a place that you're not super happy with. Very helpful. We'll cover some of these other copy Osc A to B settings and vice versa when we cover the oscillator section, so we can just ignore those for now. Same with the warps and the resamples. A few other helpful things here to note is that you can show the Serum presets folder directly, which actually will open it up in your computer, show you where you can load presets, as well as noises, LFO shapes, effects change, and a bunch of other things that you can have default settings for in Serum. That's the cool thing about Serum is it's more than just, one preset and that's all you can load. You've got presets for different parts of the synth, so it's very powerful. Coming back into the menu, you've also got the rescan folders on disk. If you have added a new preset pack, let's say from Splice or Loop Cloud, you've added it into your Serum folder, which it does normally do by default, but it's not showing up in your browser here. If you do a quick rescan folders on disk, it will then show up, or at least should. If it doesn't, there's probably something wrong with the installation of that preset pack. Really helpful. If you prefer saving a bit of extra screen real estate, let's hide the piano keyboard, which will remove that bottom keyboard section there. Very helpful. I prefer to have it on because I like to see what notes I'm playing, and I like to see the mod and pitch wheel, which is that there in the bottom left. A few other quick things. You can load and save MIDI maps. This is basically where if you have a hardware MIDI controller that you want to control certain parameters in Serum with, you can manually map those to your MIDI controller knobs, pads, or whatever, and you can save that as a MIDI map and then load it in future. I personally don't use this a whole ton. I don't think a lot of people do, but it is a helpful thing if you're performing live or you like a more hands-on workflow when you're producing music. You can also load a tuning file, which is what's called micro-tuning. This is where when you play on your keyboard, it normally generates a certain tone through these oscillators. Again, we'll cover them in a second. The tuning file will offset the pitch of those by a little bit each note. This gets what's called microtonal sounds or microtonal music, where each of the notes on the keyboard aren't accurately representing the actual frequency they are supposed to. They're a bit offset, and sometimes you can get some really cool tones out of a tuning effect like that. So if that's something you're into, go for it. And we'll cover the lock effect racks and save effects chains and stuff like that when we talk about the effects section. Very powerful stuff there. And MPE we will talk about at the end when we also talk about modulation and mapping and stuff like that. That's all you need to know for now. Okay, so now let's talk about the oscillator section, which is the bread and butter of how Serum operates. Like I said, it's this section at the top here, and the oscillators in Serum are kind of these four squares here: the sub, the noise, the oscillator A, and the oscillator B. These all generate sound. Without them, you can't really get anything out of Serum. Now, we turn each of these sections on with this little blue LED here. You'll notice if I play something on my keyboard like you're seeing down in the bottom there, without any oscillators on, we get no sound. With one of them on, we suddenly get sound. We can use multiple of them and change them to get different textures. Very, very cool. Let me just initialize that again there. So we have 4 different sound generation sources. What the heck is the difference between them? Well, oscillator A and B are the same. It's just the same thing we can use 2 of, right? But the sub and the noise sections are different. Now, sub is designed to be a sub oscillator. It's a very simple oscillator to generate a sort of lower end tone in a given sound. Really good for basses. For example, if you just want to like layer a sine wave an octave below, very helpful to just put that in there, and so on. Then the noise oscillator is more of a sampler. So what I mean by a sampler is it literally takes audio files and plays them. And it is usually used to add noise to a sound. So if I turn it on there, you'll hear, if I turn up the noise comes through in the signal, right? So these are our 4 ingredients, and they are used to create any number of different sounds. Now let's do a bit of a deep dive into each of these, right? Let's start with the main oscillators. So this will apply to both A and B here, right? So we turn them on. Now the first thing you'll notice at the top here is this default thing. Now this is a saw wave if you're not familiar. This is the default wavetable that gets loaded up when you load up Serum. Again, Serum is a wavetable synthesizer, as you've probably seen advertised everywhere. And this, what we're seeing here, is a wavetable. Now, you can select between a number of different wavetable presets in this menu here by clicking on the default, finding the folder you want to, and clicking on one of them. For example, now we've got a different one in here, and it sounds different to before. Similar with the preset browser, we can actually use these left and right arrows to navigate between different presets. Right? Different wavetable presets, that is. Now, some of them have different characteristics. Some of them sound the same, but we'll get to that in just a second. Now, on any given wavetable, you can change a number of different parameters. So we can see here this Oct, Sem, Fin, and CRS. This is the pitch section. So what this does, as I play notes, is change the way the oscillator generates sound, how fast it's generating sound. The Oct control, as you may have guessed, controls the octave that this oscillator is playing in. So higher sounds higher, and lower sounds lower. Right? And you can use this to relatively make things higher or lower in comparison to other oscillators, which is really cool. The semitone does this for semitones instead of octaves. So for example, if I wanted to have 2 oscillators and I wanted to put a semitone, 3 semitones in this case apart, I could do that. Just playing 1 note there, but 2 tones are being generated. Pretty cool. A very common semitone interval you'll find a lot of presets used in electronic music is 7. And sometimes 5. And very occasionally 3, although it's not super common. Very interesting to know that. You've then got the fine and the coarse pitch. So the fine pitch is a very, very subtle offset in pitch. In fact, if I bring the semitones back down here to 0, I'm going to offset the fine pitch of oscillator B against oscillator A, and it will just offset them both enough so that you hear this thickness get added to the sound. Really awesome. And if I turn off oscillator A and just move it on its own, you can hear that subtle warping on the pitch that's going on. Very handy for getting sort of analog thickening type effects. And then, of course, you've got the coarse pitch. Pun not intended, but it happened anyway. So the coarse pitch is basically a more intense version of what fine pitch is doing. It's not working in steps like the octave or the semitones control is. It's just moving the pitch a bunch, like so. And this is great for getting very crazy pitch effects. Now I'm going to press Option click. Oh, doesn't actually work. Never mind. I'm going to double click and press 0 instead. It's other controls. That's Option. Command click is what resets things back to default, by the way. That's what I was trying there. But back to coarse pitch, right? It's very helpful for getting some crazy effects. You can right click and reset the control as well. We'll use this especially with our modulation stuff like LFOs and envelopes. It's a very handy control to know. And again, the range of course is just a lot wider than what fine pitch is capable of. We only have 100 cents is what that number is referring to there. Either way, coarse we can go. Now this number here is semitones actually. But you notice that 0.16 or whatever, so we know it's a continuous way of working. Very helpful. Press that face to get rid of that weird yellow line. And that is the pitch section. Now, again, if you choose a different wavetable, you have different shapes, different looking things, and they all sound different. Now, I want to share with you a few very important wavetable presets here that you will use. The main one you will use is basic shapes. Now, basic shapes is important because this represents the plethora of different wavetables that are used on the most classic synths in existence. So if you're not familiar, this is a sine wave. This, if we move this wavetable position down here, can cycle through to a new position in this wavetable. This is a saw wave. This is a triangle wave, similar to a sine, but a bit beefier. Square wave, probably the densest of them all. And then you've got different variations on the square wave. This is what's called pulse width modulation. The differences between this one, and this one. Sounds a bit thinner. This one, yet again, even thinner. Then you've got this tri-saw sort of one. Somewhere between a square and a saw wave. Very cool sound. And so these, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sounds, I think it is, are classic. Now you'll notice this view just changed. Well, I just clicked on this view and I've gone to the 3D mode. Very helpful for seeing all the frames in a wavetable, right? We can see as I move that wavetable knob, it selects through them. Right now, certain wavetables have more static frames that we can swap between, almost like a different number of presets within a wavetable. But other ones, especially the digital ones, will have a more continuous frame movement. Basically, instead of having 7 frames like we did before, we now have 64 in this case. Right, and then different ones. This one has 256 frames, which is even more. Really cool. I love this evil long Reese one. So that's very helpful to know because different wavetable presets will react differently. Now, a few of these other controls here. Now, for now, we're going to ignore this little pencil icon. This is what leads us to the Wavetable Editor. Now, we don't want to play around with this just yet because that's quite an advanced feature. Again, that number there indicates the frame you are on in this wavetable. It disappears on the 2D mode, so just bear in mind. Go back to the default wavetable position. Now, there's a few other things here. The first thing we have here is the unison control. Now, if we increase and click and drag the unison control, we see these green and yellow lines come up. Now, what the heck are they? Well, basically, unison duplicates the oscillator a number of times, giving each one a slight detune as if we were to adjust the fine pitch of each of them, but also pans them slightly left or right. As you hear when I increase this unison, we start to get this thick, wide sound to any oscillator that we are using. Very, very helpful. Now, the green lines that determine the basically secondary voices, I would call them, and that yellow line is that central voice. Now, if you're using an even number of unison voices, you're going to get 2 central voices. Now, there are some sound design implications for that we'll discuss probably in another video, but one thing that's helpful to know is I tend to use odd numbers for unison just to avoid any sort of weird issues with my sounds, although there's nothing particularly wrong with it. It's just good to know that central voice being in the middle, being one of them rather than 2, is a helpful thing for minimizing phase destruction is what it's called. So helpful to know. Again, you don't have to understand everything about it. Good to know. Now, the amount of pitch difference between each of those however many voices you've got here is determined by the detune knob. As you see, as I play a note, closer in is more tight sounding, and then wider is more random and thick, to a point where it's almost too much. Now, different sounds are going to have different amounts of detune that they need to get the sound you're going for. It is very helpful to know. What this blend knob does is it actually emphasizes that central original oscillator slightly more than the detune voices in terms of volume. So imagine we have the main oscillator just turned up louder. That's what the blend knob does there. And you see it visually with that yellow line coming through a lot louder, to a point where if we have the blend at 0, we basically are getting almost no unison at this point. In fact, if I turn the unison down now, it's basically the same, except it's just quieter. So the blend is helpful for getting the right amount of volume blend between the wider, thicker sounds and the original. I kind of like it here for this sound, and I'd bring up the volume here to compensate. Obviously, this level here, as we have now seen, is the volume of this particular oscillator, not the overall master volume, which I'll cover in a second. There we go. Now, there's a few other controls here. We've got the phase. Now, the phase we kind of had a brief sneak peek at before because I was messing around with it. This simply determines the start point at which Serum is going to generate this oscillator. Right, so if I click on it here, you can see the value here is 180 degrees. Now, we can move this left or right. Now, if we play this as is, we don't get that many differences, right? It's because what we're hearing is not really that audible. When we start here or here or here, it doesn't really matter when we're just using one oscillator in isolation, but it does matter when we have multiple oscillators going on at the same time. For example, if I turned down this random knob, now by the way, the random knob actually randomizes the start point of each note we press. So if we have this yellow shaded area covering the whole wavetable, it means the synth could start here, 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 or on any given note. And that gets a very random analog type sound. However, you'll notice in certain types of sounds that you're designing, particularly bass sounds, you may want to not use a random oscillator because you may want to make sure that the two wavetables you're using are aligned in volume. For example, if I have the phase off random on both of these two oscillators, I have one starting at the sort of midpoint here, and I play those together, you get a sort of certain effect, right? Each note starts the same. It's a little bit more digital and predictable. Now, if I move the phase of this oscillator A more towards the beginning, you'll see that the oscillator B's phase starting point being in the middle there, that's what we call the zero crossing, is the same as here, where it's starting at the middle point. You'll hear that these two wavetables now interact differently. And as I move this one, different values actually sound better or worse depending. Now, that works for certain types of sounds. I'm going to increase the random on both again. I'm going to command click on the phase to bring that back to normal there. And I'm actually going to turn off oscillator A for now. We're going to go just back to oscillator B. Helpful to know that phase and rand though. Again, we've covered wavetable position. Don't need to go over that again. It just moves through that wavetable. But where the fun really begins, I feel, with oscillators and wavetables beyond what we've covered is this warp menu. Now, if you click here, you'll see a drop down of a bunch of different modes. These are all going to warp the oscillator frames differently. I'm going to just play through a bunch of them, and I want you to listen, see, and hear what's going on. So we'll start off with sync. Very cool. We're going to go sync half window. very similar. It just adds a bit of a fade either side, so it's a bit more of a smoother sort of effect, not as bright. Sync window is even more so. Even more of a fade sort of effect. Pretty cool. So bend plus kind of skews the waveform towards the middle, as you can see there. Great for squelchy sort of effects. Bend minus does the opposite. It bends it towards the outside. Great for crazy modulation as well. And then you've got one that's got both baked into one, so you can go in or out. Very handy. PWM adds a bit of a gap at the end of the wavetable, similar to what we were seeing with those basic shapes, square waves. Some were thinner than others. Great for adding like these raspy, nasty sort of effects to sounds. We've got asymmetrical. Kind of skews it towards the left with the plus mode, towards the right with the minus mode. Sounds cool for different sounds. And then we got both ways. Very helpful. We got a flip mode, which is kind of helpful for creating just random coolness in your sounds. Kind of just draws a flipped version of the wavetable over the top of itself. I feel like if you modulate this slowly, you get some cool effects, but fast, it can be a bit too crazy. Very dependent on the sound you're going for, though. Right. We've got mirror. Really, really sick. I love mirror for like just getting really interesting, unpredictable results. It basically kind of mirrors one side of the wavetable over the other. Sounds awesome there. Remap and basically all of these 4 remap modes all work differently. I encourage you to edit them and create like sort of your own relationship. It basically will move the wavetable according to this graph grid that you draw in here. So you can see I've just drawn in something there. You can get really funky with them. These modes all work slightly differently. Remap 2 kind of duplicates the same oscillator twice in the same frame. It gets a more high-pitched sound. And 3 does the same thing. It's getting an even higher-pitched sound. Really interesting. And then 4, of course, 4 versions. Really interesting results you can get with this one. Have a play around. Quantize kind of adds a more step sort of effect to the sound. Sounds like a downsampler, if anyone is familiar with that. I like to use this just a little bit to give sounds a certain little bit of crunch sometimes. Gives it a bit of like a digital sort of just nastiness to it. I quite like it. Obviously, more exaggerated results are a bit dirtier. Really cool one there. And then you've got the FM, AM, and RM settings. This is where you can actually introduce FM into the signal. Now, I'm going to quickly demonstrate what that does without going into the complexities of FM synthesis and going so deep. That probably is going to require a completely different video in a different synth, because Serum is not primarily a FM synthesizer, but it is capable of it. And I like using these effects just for different sort of textures in my sounds. So for example, I'm going to enable Oscillator A now. I'm actually going to turn the level down so it's not coming out of the main output. So we're having it on, but we're not hearing it like we would here. Right? Now, why the heck would we do that? Well, FM. We can actually select FM from A, bring the knob down to the bottom for now, and this is going to apply what's called frequency modulation to oscillator B based on what's going on in oscillator A. Frequency modulation is really fast pitch movement, and like so fast, the sound just kind of goes crazy, right? So let's bring this up and just hear what happens, right? Really cool effects. Now, not only does the amount of this effect get determined by the warp knob amount here, But the actual source sound in Oscillator A will change this. So if I actually move the wavetable position of Oscillator A, we get different amounts of different types of movement. Different wavetables will yield different results. Different octaves and semitone values will yield different results. Really nasty stuff there. This is really good, as you can see, for bass sounds in particular. We can also use it in more subtle ways. But yeah, really, really helpful. Again, I would try going up octaves and use 7 semitones again as a nice kind of interval there. Really nasty results. Now, there's different types of modulation beyond frequency modulation. There's amplitude modulation, or AM. Slightly different way of working, and it's going to affect the sound differently. Amplitude modulation is really fast volume movement. So this oscillator A is now moving the volume of oscillator B really fast. Just sounds different. Again, different values here. Get different results. Then you've got RM, which is very similar to how FM works. It's just a little bit different. Or it's actually kind of similar to how AM works as well. Sometimes it's nice to play around with those three. FM tends to be the one I use the most, though. I'll be honest. And most people do too. Now, there is also FM from Noise Oscillator and Sub Oscillator. This will do it from these two ones, as you can probably imagine. Obviously, Oscillator A has from B. You can't self-modulate itself, unfortunately, but it is from the other one. You could, for example, if you wanted to self-modulate, you just make Oscillator A and B the exact same, and then modulate from one as long as the level is down, right? But yeah, you can do it from the Noise Oscillator as well, which is pretty cool. My favorite little hack here is to, let's say we're using the Noise Oscillator, have it turned down. You can modulate Oscillator A from the Noise Oscillator and get different results by then modulating FM from A. Because A is being modulated by the noise, we get some sick sounds. Changing the noise gets different results then. But we're getting ahead of ourselves now because we haven't even covered what the Noise Oscillator is. That is the basics of the oscillator. Now, of course, I'm going to turn off these two here now. You've got also, in addition to the level control, you've got panning. I find this helpful for setting, say, two oscillators slightly either side of one another. Can be helpful for certain sounds, right? Let's bring that back to normal. I'm actually going to initialize the patch now, and we'll go back to default. Now, let's cover over the sub and noise oscillators very briefly. Now, as we've covered, sub is just a very simplified version of the oscillator here. You don't have tons of pitch controls. It's not a fully fledged wavetable oscillator. It's only got like 6 different options. Very similar to the basic shapes one. But we don't have a tri-square. We also have this rounded sign, which is pretty cool. And basically, again, you want to use it to add weight to sounds. Generally speaking. It's got its own volume. Pan. Very helpful. And octave control. Go back to 0 there. But the one interesting thing about this one is the direct out. Now, as we'll cover very shortly, there are effects in Serum. Direct out will bypass any effects that is going on in the synth. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, effects can sometimes transform the sound so drastically that you just want one frequency or one oscillator to come through unaffected by all the crazy stuff going on in the effects section. And this will bypass all of that stuff so that there's a single tone still coming out underneath, adding that weight that you normally want the sub oscillator to add. Okay, so very helpful to know the direct out. You'll find a lot of presets will use that, again, especially bass presets here, but also leads and keys and other sounds too. Again, the noise oscillator is a great way to add texture to any sound. There is a number of different noises that come with Serum. Again, I've got some third-party ones loaded up here, so mine may look a little bit different to yours. The cool thing is you can load any sound into this oscillator, not just in terms of what's listed here. In fact, I could actually go into Serum and load up a sound by clicking and dragging, and it will load that in Serum. Right? I'm literally just playing this now. I can actually change a few of the things as well. So I can set this to one-shot mode. This means it will play non-looping. By default, a lot of the noise samples will be looped because you want it to continue to play as you're holding down a note. One-shot is useful if you're adding, say, a nice plucky sort of sound to the beginning of a synth, though. For example, there are some attacks misc. If we play that, it just sounds really buzzy. But if we play this, it's just a one-off click that's not looping, and it's great for adding a punch at the beginning of the sound. So that's quite helpful. But again, with a more like noise sample, we don't want that, because if I'm holding down the note continually like I am now, it stops playing. But with this off, it keeps playing. You've also got key tracking, which changes the pitch of the sample of noise based on what key you're playing. Sometimes you want this, sometimes you don't. With noise samples in particular, you don't want this on because you want the noise to be consistent between each note. But if you have key tracking on, it will sound like this, which is good for more tonal noise samples. Again, I don't really want it in this case. You've got phase and rand controls. In this case, phase just changes how long into the sample does it play. Again, if I drag these birds back on, if I notice there's a bit of silence at the beginning of the sample, I could use the phase to move that around. Now, you'll notice when I move the phase knob, you get these really cool, like, pitchy tape effects. Really awesome. So as we'll cover, modulating the noise here can be an awesome way to get cool, crazy sounds. And then random obviously will then change the random position of the start time, so every single note is different. Like just there. You can adjust the actual pitch of the noise sample itself. Now, if you have key tracking enabled, this will be the root pitch that it adjusts, and every other note will be adjusted accordingly. Very cool effects there. And then you've got pan and level volume. You've also got direct out too if you want the noise to cut through the effects and not get processed there. I don't tend to use that a whole lot, but I know people who have done this. For example, when they're adding like another tonal layer over the top of the main synth, this is a great way to add just a quick second layer without having to load up a second synth or second sampler or something like that separate to Serum. So it definitely is something that can be used, which is pretty cool. The funny thing is when you hover over it, it says sub osc direct output. It's funny because that's not the sub oscillator this one is, but the notes have just been left in there, funnily enough. And that is pretty much it for the noise oscillator. Now, while I think of it, you not only can drag third-party samples into the noise oscillator, but you can also do this with oscillators. You're like, what? How the heck does that work? I thought this wasn't really sounds. I thought it was just generating a certain wave. Well, you can convert an audio sample to waves. So for example, this bird sound, if I wanted to convert this to a wavetable, what I would do is click and drag, and now you'll see all these different options come up, right? Depending on what you want to do and how you want to import that sample into this wavetable. Now, all of these are slightly different. Basically, it really depends on what type of sound you're trying to get out of the original sample. For example, this one, constant frame size, will just simply chop the audio sample in a bunch of different places kind of constantly. This one here will try and follow the pitch of the sample, as will this one. It will kind of, this one will kind of work well with a pitched sample that's one note. This one will work well with material that has multiple different notes in the audio sample. This one's a good kind of default to try. And these ones are good to try just to see if they work better than any of the other three, to be honest. That's how I use them. In this case, I'm going to try dynamic pitch follow because it's kind of a bird sample and might sound really cool. So let's bring that in there. Might have to try that again if it doesn't work. It was a bit long, I was holding it there. There we go. Okay, so now we got this sound. I'm going to click on 3D mode here. Okay, so that didn't work too well. Let's try bringing in a different mode. That kind of sounds okay. I might try one of these other modes. Doesn't sound that great. Probably not a great sample to use, to be honest. Let's try the pitch average. Yeah, because there's silence at the beginning, I think it's not quite working well. And this is, the reality of how it works. Now I'm going to bring in this kalimba note instead. I'm going to use the 0 snap pitch because it's a single note. Let's see how that sounds when we load it in. That's really cool. And then you can hear as I play a note and move the wavetable position, I can hear the texture of the original sound, which is really, really cool. So you can do this with all sorts of sounds. Try the different modes and see what works well. Sometimes it sounds terrible. Sometimes it sounds amazing. Right. Now, a few extra things here to note about oscillators before we move on. I mentioned in the menu there was some extra oscillator settings here. Very helpful for when you're working with oscillators and you're wanting to quickly do things and copy them across to the other oscillator. So for example, I can quickly copy oscillator A over to B, right? Which is very helpful. And I can do B to A, right? So that means whatever is on here will go there and vice versa. Now you also have copy oscillator A to B with mods and B to A with mods. That will be copying any movement we add from LFOs, envelopes, and other sources, which again, we're going to cover when we go over those things. But it will basically copy any movement on those oscillators that we're adding. Very helpful to know. So use those to save yourself time. Very, very helpful. The other cool thing you can do here is you can render the warping mode. So for example, if I go to oscillator A here, I select mirror as the warping mode, right? On this particular frame. Maybe I like the sound, right? What I can then do is I can render oscillator A's warp to a new wavetable. And basically what this allows me to do, and I'm actually going to turn off the mirror warping mode now, is you can see here as I move through the wavetable position, the mirror is now the wavetable position. Really cool. This allows us to add multiple different layers of warping to the same oscillator. Very awesome. So now I could, for example, instead of just having mirror, I could also have quantize. Right. So it's really helpful. You can do that on oscillator A and B. And then lastly, you can resample oscillator A or B or both to themselves. So for example, what this will do is it will listen to the sound that's being played out of Serum. It will kind of play a single note internally inside Serum, listen to that, put it into oscillator A. Now what this does is it actually listens to it post effects, post modulation, so it listens to the final output as if we have a sample in our DAW's browser that we're dragging back in and dragging onto oscillator A. Now, why the heck would we want to do this? Well, if we're adding sort of cool effects and stuff like that, we're adding cool movement to our sound, we want to capture that, and then we want to do more of it inside the same instance of Serum. Resampling allows us to put that in a wavetable, and then the movement that's captured as the sound plays over time is then added to the wavetable position. So I'm not going to add, or actually I am going to add, but I'm not going to explain all the effects I'm going to add now. I'm just going to add a bunch. Right, I'm actually going to add a bit of movement as well. I'm not going to explain what it is. And I'm going to add a filter here really quick as well. I'm now going to resample this to oscillator A. Right, I'm actually going to turn off the filter and disable this LFO now. And now look what happens when I move the wavetable position. The movement we had in the synth is now in the wavetable position. How sick is that? Really, really cool stuff. Again, once you understand the power of the effects and modulations, this is going to become a lot more useful. So stick around for the rest of the masterclass. Now, you can also do this on Oscillator B, and then Oscillator A and B will do it for the stereo image. So if there's a lot of stereo effects, it sounds really wide and full, you're using unison, for example, it will do it for both. So if I go ahead here and add hyperdimension, right? Add stuff like this. I can go and resample A and B. I'm going to turn off our effects for now. And then you'll see if I turn on oscillator A and B, the left and right are now captured in A and B. So we would probably want to be moving the wavetable position of oscillator A and B together. Probably at a slower rate. Kind of sounds like the classic modern talking wavetable from Massive, if anyone knows what I mean. And that is a really, really cool, handy feature for creative sound design. Now, as you can see, Serum's oscillators are super powerful, so I'd encourage you at this point to pause the video, have a play around with them yourself, and then next on our list, we're going to be covering the filter, which is the next super important way you can sculpt and shape your sounds, as you got a little bit of a sneak peek at just then. So I'll see you then. So I've just initialized our preset here, back to a normal saw wave, the default one, and we're going to enable the filter here with that blue LED. Now the filter takes whatever audio material is currently routed to it, denoted by this blue LED on the left-hand side here. So we see A is turned on, that means A is sending into the filter, whereas B, the noise, and the sub are currently not. So if we wanted to send all of our oscillators through the filter, we would enable all of these. The reason you might not want to do this, by the way, is you might want, let's say, oscillator A to go through the filter, but you might want B to come through unaffected. So this one, affected by the filter. This one, not. We can hear that by the amount of brightness in the sound. Anyway, back to oscillator A. Now, by default, you see this mode here loaded up, MG Low 12. This is one of the standard low-pass filters, which takes the high end out of the sound. I generally find I stick to these top 4 for most sound design. I also use the high pass, band pass, peak, and notch, but most of the normal filters is what I stick to, particularly the top 4. The top 4 sound very analog and rich. For example, I love using the steeper 24 dB per octave one, which is great for getting tighter, cleaner sounds. I find the 12 and 6 are better for sort of fatter, broader sounds, for lack of a better term. A little bit more of the mid-range is let through there, while still dulling the sound, which is a helpful thing to know. That's what that number denotes on pretty much all of the bands here, is the steepness. So higher number is steeper and more clean sounding. Again, these are all standard filter types. So we've got our normal low-pass filters as well, which sound a little less analog. Then we've got high-pass filters. The cutoff frequency, determining the cutoff point of that filter. Band passes. Peaks, which is just kind of like an EQ boost. Can increase the resonance to see that there more. Still passes through all the audio. It just adds a sort of resonant peak at one point. 24 dB per octave 2. For more narrow ones. And then notch. Great for thinning out the sound and adding this squelchy sort of sound. Really helpful to see what's going on there. Again, resonance really controlling how tight or resonant it sounds. Really, really cool there. Now, beyond the normal filters, we have multi-filters, which basically do 2 filters in one. So we could add a low pass and a high pass at 6 dB, a low pass and a high pass at 12, a low pass and a band pass, a low pass and a peak, a low pass and a notch, a high pass and a band, etc., etc. And then you've also got 3 at the bottom too, which is really, really cool. One of my favorites here is the double notch filter. If anyone's used Massive before, this is very similar to how the double notch filter in Massive works. Now, you can control the normal cutoff of the notch filter with this one here, but the frequency of the second one you see comes in there. The resonance affects the resonance of both of them. And you can move those independently, pretty cool as well. This freak knob, by the way, does change between the different filter types you use. It's kind of a auxiliary knob. For example, if I go back to a normal knob, you'll see this goes to fat, which is kind of like a volume boost. Although it's not really doing anyone in that one, it's more this one. Okay, it doesn't do anything there either. So nothing is actually really going on there. It's just adding a bit of filters. Yeah, so it's not actually used on all the types there. I forgot to mention that. Should have mentioned that. Oh well. Now, we've obviously got the 3 filter types. So this one would be a low pass, peak, and high pass. Really, really cool. What we can do is morph. So we've got this. The first one will be determined by this cutoff here. And the peak and high pass will be morphed between. So this one here is morphing between a peak and a high pass, right? So we morph between the 3 filter types there. Very helpful. You get some crazy movements with this too. Really fun to play around with. I use them sometimes, not all the time. Very helpful to play around with. Then we get a bit more creative with the flanges. So we've got 3 main categories here. We've got combs, flanges, and phases. Combs sound quite tonal, especially if we bring the resonance up. The plus, minus, and the different modes all sound slightly different. Really like squelchy. This one has like a low pass baked into it. High pass, high and low pass, similar to how the multi filters work. You got this variation knob here. Really fun to play around with these multi-types with the flanges and combs and stuff. Same with flanger. This one sounds a little more metallic-y to me. But very similar effect. You got different types. Really fun stuff there to play around with. And you got phases as well, which sound more sort of thin and nasally, I would say. Now, the number here is just the amount of sort of stages in the phaser. So the higher the number, the more nasally it sounds. And the more it kind of moves the spectrum around. Lots of fun to play around with those there. You got these flanger phases at the bottom here as well. Lots of fun to play around with those. Just 2 different positive and negative. They just work slightly differently on the audio spectrum, the frequencies. Then lastly, you've got everyone's favorite category, miscellaneous. And miscellaneous is just a bunch of extra cool filters that they've put in. They all do different things, mostly pretty self-explanatory, although some of them you just kind of have to play with them to figure out. Go through all of these. I would encourage you in your own time just to see what they do. For example, this one just boosts the low end. Sort of like an EQ. Got a few different EQs there. Ring mod is similar to how the RM on the warp mode sounds. So that's what this is doing to an extent. Sort of crazy pitch stuff. You got a ×2 mode for a different texture. Bit higher pitched. Good for radio kind of glitches. Sample and hold is like quantize. Sounds kind of like a downsampler. And then you got sample and hold minus. Really glitchy sounding. You got this combs filter, which is just absolutely nuts sounding. I think combs, reverb, and all passes are really commonly used in a lot of crazy bass design. They just sound really resonant and add this instant sort of texture to things. The reverb filter is kind of overused in a lot of cases, but it sounds really cool. You can dampen the sound a bit. It sounds cool when you move the cutoff as well. So it's a really fun one. All passes as well. Lots of fun there. And then you've got a few other random ones like different types of low pass filters, formant filters, which add like a vowel sound. Sometimes cool. 3 different versions. And then you've got like these distorted combs and screams. Screams sound really cool, to be honest. Really squelchy. Really nice. And then the bandpass version really just adds this squelchy texture. Yeah. Again, distorted combs with the low pass, band pass, 2 different types. They sound really good as well. Again, I encourage you just to go around and play with the miscellaneous ones. That's my biggest recommendation because you can really discover how you're going to use them for yourself when you're playing around with them. So that's all the filter types. Now, these same filter types apply to the filter that we're going to cover in the effects too, although the one in the effects section is not as visual as what we get here in the oscillator section. So we've covered cutoff and resonance, the resonance being how intense the peaks sound in any of the filter types. We do have a pan knob to pan the effect. This basically creates a slightly different cutoff for the left and right, basically. So it's not like the entire sound is just to the left now, it's just that the right is not as affected by the filter. We've then got a mix knob. This blends the unprocessed, unfiltered version of the signal with the filtered version. So if you have like some crazy movements or something, let's say we add like a combs, and you wanted to blend that back to taste, you could do that there, which is really cool. Again, we've covered this as like the miscellaneous knob. It kind of depends on which filter you're using, what it does. There's also, if you click on the mix here, you can switch between a level, how loud the volume is coming into the filter. This can be really cool because you can modulate this and kind of use it as like a drive function to an extent. I don't recommend doing it all the time, but it is cool nonetheless. I normally would rather use the mix though personally. Pretty cool. Couple of other features. So there's a key track on the filter here as well. This moves the cutoff depending on the notes. So for example, if you had a comb filter like this, you got the cutoff to a very particular value. That kind of resonated well with the note that you're playing. Let's say that there, right? If I flick this on, it will actually change it, but this will actually then change the cutoff with each note that I play. So I'm going to retune this. So the movement of the filter moves with the notes. Super helpful for certain types of sounds. For example, if you want like the amount of high end or low end in a sound to be consistent, you can use it on this. Very helpful there, right? Love that effect. I'm going to turn that off for now. Now the last feature here, you can see if you click on the view, we get a little bit of a spectrum analyzer, which is awesome. The blue one is the original. The green one is the affected version. So we can see which frequencies are being taken out by our filter. This goes for any mode. Very helpful. Then if we click again, we can see the phases. Now, for most people, the phases are not going to be relevant. It just shows the phase movement of the signal based on the filter type you're using. Again, similar to how the phase moves one oscillator away from another in time, a filter will move certain frequencies in a sound away from each other in time. And that can create different movements in the sound, sometimes desirable, sometimes undesirable. And if you ever come up with that problem, it can be helpful to look at where movement is being made in the frequencies across the spectrum. Very helpful to know. So 3 clicks and you're back to normal there. Now, I believe that's pretty much all of the features on the filter. I don't think I'm missing anything here. So again, you can put all of your sounds through the filter if you want to. I'm just going to bring this back here. of our sounds are now being affected by the filter, all of our oscillators. Very, very handy. Now, of course, we can modulate stuff, which we're going to cover very shortly in the filter to get a lot of movement in the sound. And it's very key in creating the movement in many sounds that you're probably wanting to create yourself. So once we understand what a filter is, and now that we do, we can then talk a bit about modulation. But before we talk about modulation, we're going to talk about effects. So let's head there now, see what effects we've got in Serum and how we can transform our kind of basic sound into something really full, professional, and nuanced. Can't wait. Let's see that now. Okay, so now we're going to look at the effects section here. We're going to process our existing oscillators going through the filter with a variety of effects. Now, we kind of demonstrated the filter briefly before, but what we're going to do here is step through each of these effects on the left-hand side here. Now, by default, all of the effects with the initial patch will be turned off. Now, we turn them on by enabling this LED button here. There's going to be a different color for each effect. Now, we also have an off button on the right-hand side of the rack here to bypass the effect. This is helpful for when we want to see what an effect is doing to the sound without fully removing it from our view, right? This, however, will actually remove the effect from view, which also will turn it off. That's just good to know the difference between those two buttons. Now, let's start with hyperdimension, which is actually two effects in one here. So let's just play a note from our synth. I'm going to turn the mix on these both effects down, and we're going to start by bringing it up on the hyper, right? So let's play it dry and increase this as we go. Right, so it actually acts very similarly to how detune or unison acts on the oscillator, except it sounds a little bit more sort of thick. It doesn't sound as pitchy and different in terms of that, although you can make it more pitchy with the amount of detune. This is a slightly different effect, and it's, to me, sounds a little more usable for certain types of sounds. Now, the rate and detune will affect the amount of pitch differences as well as the amount of unison. So more unison is going to mean more voices, which is going to mean a thicker sound, right? We can max it out at 7 here. And we can adjust the rate and detune to taste. The hyper rate kind of moves the voices around and gives it this like almost chorus-like effect. And the detune is the amount of movement there. And so I like it for this sound sitting around there. There is also this retrig option, which will start all of our unison voices at the same phase, giving it this like almost like ricochet type effect. Great for old school synth sounds. Really love to use this one. So that's hyper, great for thickening out sounds. We then also have dimension, which adds a very short sort of delayed reverb behind the sound. This is great for just adding a bit of extra thickness to the sound. So I'm just going to bring this up here. So without it and with it. You hear that sort of effect, and we can blend the exact amount of mix that we like there to taste, as well as adjust the size to see how much or how big of an effect we get. So we could have the mix up really high and the size down really low. It's a very short, stabby sort of delay with this. But with a big size, it's a longer tail, right? And this is great for those kind of 80s sounding gated snares or gated synth type sounds. Really awesome effect. Great on leads and basses generally. And that is hyper and dimension. Really simple but powerful effects. You can use them in conjunction with each other, or you can just use them one off. Either or is fine. Okay, so a bit of a different look now. I've just upgraded to Ableton 12 in the background, as you may be able to see. We're going to cover distortion next. So let's go ahead here and just enable this orange LED. And you will see the distortion unit come up. Now, there's a few simple but very useful knobs here. The first thing you'll see on the left-hand side is the mode. Now, if you click here, you'll get access to all of the different modes in one menu, or you can simply press left or right to quickly select between them there. You'll have tube up by default, which is a great all-around distortion for a lot of different sounds, whether it's basses, leads, pads, whatever. Can just really add this pleasant distortion. Now we use the drive knob here to increase the amount of distortion effect. So as you can hear, very distorted, hardly distorted, kind of in the middle, right? And it's really about dialing in that perfect amount of drive. And of course, you can blend the dry wet here on the distortion as well. You'll see it actually affects the appearance of this wave shape view, which is pretty cool. So you can actually see how it's affecting the intensity of the distortion visually. If I'm going to use a little less on the mix, I'll tend to use more of the drive and kind of treat this as a parallel distortion unit, whereby I have a bit of the original unprocessed dry signal and the more aggressive distorted signal, like so. I can blend the exact amount of the distortion I want in. So sometimes it's nice, especially on maybe a more like simple sine-based sound. If you want to add a bunch of distortion, that's cool, but sometimes you just want to add it in parallel. So it's more of a subtle background sort of effect. Very cool. I'm going to go ahead and add my oscillator A and B back on there. Now, of course, there's different modes here. They all sound different. Soft clip is a more subtle distortion, great for more like just warming up sounds. Right, very nice there. Hard clip's more aggressive and digital sounding. Has that bite to it, which is quite nice for certain types of very brash sounds. Diode 1 is very, very intense sounding, a bit more kind of gritty. Really nice on basses. I think it's like tube on steroids, is the way I like to think of it. You've got Diode 2, which is very textured, especially as you drive it, right? This is really good to modulate the drive on Diode 2, which is something I'll cover later. Linear fold is also one that you probably don't want to use a lot of drive on. It's very textured, and it's also something that you can modulate, but you'll notice as I start from the bottom drive, crazy basses on basses, right? You can use it on things like leads too. Very good for like digital brash sounding stuff. And this also goes for sinoid fold. I think sinoid fold's probably even more intense, to be honest. Or just slightly different at least. Very cool. You got zero square. Sounds kind of more like a roaring type of distortion. It sounds very like, almost like a bit crusher. Very good for this intense distortion effects when especially on high amounts of drive. Hear that there. You got downsample, which again this is actually like a downsampler, right? Great to use on like, you know, yoi basses basically. So if you've got like just a sine, get some really cool effects there. Lots of fun to modulate the drive on that one. Asymmetrical just has its own sort of character. Very nice. Rectify is like a very sort of destructive form of distortion. Really thins it out on high amounts of drive, which is great to modulate again. You can get some cool modulation effects there. You move the drive, you get X shaper, which is where you can actually change your starting wave shape point here. This is a bit more advanced from one to the other. So if we leave edit A on the standard default, we can actually create our own crazy shape, even load in an LFO here from the LFO library, which we're going to cover in the modulation section in a second. We've got our own ones. We can load in, like, say, sidechain here. And then watch what happens when I move the drive knob, right? It actually moves to match this shape here, which is crazy. So I can go to something really weird like this. What? That's crazy. Let's go to another one. Well, Oh man, and then modulating these, you're gonna have so much fun. So definitely do that. You got an asymmetrical version of this, which basically applies it across the entire, like both sides of the waveform the same. So you get some really wonky distortion effects this way. Be careful with asymmetrical distortion because it can mess with your waveforms, but good to play around with. Sine shaper as well here is very similar to the sinoid fold, but it's got like this extra movement layer. So if I compare this to sinoid fold, it's got a cool sound. But sinoid shaper or sine shaper, I find it a bit more usable. It doesn't go too crazy, but it still does, if that makes sense. Very nice. Stompbox, kind of like an old school distortion sound. It's actually not super intense, but it just kind of makes things sound a little bigger and thicker, which is what I like about it. It sounds nice when you get the drive really up there. And if I turn that off, just adds this beefiness to sound, so I really like to use that. And lastly, tape saturation, which is just a very, again, subtle form. It's less bright than, say, the tube or even the Stompbox. Again, this is just good for, I would say, beefing out a more analog type sound. You can use that in parallel. Just add some extra pizzazz to sounds. So really, really good. And then the last feature of the distortion unit here is the filter. Now, you've got two modes, or three, should I say. You got off, which is what we've been using this whole time. That's not going to apply a filter to the distortion unit. Then you got pre, which affects the signal before it goes into the distortion. So this allows you to shape the sound of your incoming audio. And then you've got a post filter, which allows you to shape the sound of your distorted effects. So this is post distortion. So I would use pre if you're trying to drive a certain frequency into the distortion unit. It can be really cool. For example, if I get the low pass filter here, which is what it sets you on the right here with this slider, you got a band pass in the middle there and a high pass, and you can morph between those, which is pretty sick. I could go and crank the resonance on this view here, or I could use this one, depending on what I prefer to do. Find a nice resonance. Sounds sick, right, going into that distortion. Really good for driving peaks, shaping the sound. Maybe, for example, it's got too much high end into the distortion and you just want to filter it off. Maybe you just want to drive a very specific part of the frequency spectrum in there. I prefer to use bandpass filters as a modulation thing. Like, you can move this around and it just sounds squelchy. Especially on something like Sine Shaper. Sounds sick. Oh man, lots of fun. And then you've also got high pass, which can be good, you know. Lots of cool modulation possibilities there. I would use post filtering as a way to tame harsh distortion. So if there's a lot of high end added, for example, based on what you're using, you can tame that with a low pass. Or you could also just use this as a third filter in Serum, which is what some people do to kind of get extra movement in their sound. So this is a really flexible option in the distortion here. I'm going to switch this back to Stompbox for now. And we're going to move on to the next effect here, which is Flanger. Now, Flanger is one of my favorite ways of just getting metallic-y textures in Serum. Again, I've just enabled this pink LED here, which is the color for the Flanger. It's a few simple controls here. You've got a rate knob, which moves the rate of the Flanger. To know what that means, we need to hear it, what it sounds like with it on. So let's just play that now. Tons of movement there. The rate. Changes that speed, right? You're hearing that whirring sort of sound. Now, again, slow textures here are great for pads. You know, if you had like a really nice... This is probably not a good example, but bear with me. Lovely use there, just of some movement, right? And you can actually sync that to the BPM. So now this flange rate, when you move it, becomes a bar or a beat value, which is really handy. So I could have, like, say, a 1/4 note with a dotted at the end. Now that's synced to my host tempo. Really cool. Depth is the amount of movement, so it's kind of like the amplitude knob. So if you want no movement, you could bring the depth to 0. This then just becomes sort of a pointless knob, really. But the depth is what adds the movement amount. Sometimes it's good to have small amounts for fast rates and then bigger amounts for slow rates. Kind of up to you how you want to use that there. The feedback creates more of a metallic-y texture because it's feeding back the output of the flanger back into itself. Or on slower or lower, should I say, amounts of flanger, it sounds a bit more simple. Just more of a subtle movement. And then phase kind of controls whether it's a stereo effect, which it is at the moment. You're hearing movement that's different on my left and right headphones. Or if it's at 0, it's a mono effect. So it's applying the flanger effect to both my left and right the exact same. I like using the 0 phase on basses because it kind of keeps things coherent and central. But, 180 degrees phase might make a bit more sense on, let's say, a pad or a lead of a certain kind or an effect. So feel free to use that and play around with the different values in between. Sometimes you might have a specific place you want this phase knob to exist. Mono versus a little bit of stereo. So they're kind of the same, but not quite. That would be a great example of how I would use it on a lead or something. Really cool. And then, of course, a mix knob to blend the original with the dry signal. Great. And that is flanger. Okay, let's flick on the phaser here, and we're going to turn off the flanger just because otherwise the sound's probably going to get a little too crazily modulated, and we're not going to hear what the phaser is actually doing because these are very similar but different effects. So, the phaser, you may or may not know how a phaser works in Serum, but basically it's a very thinning sort of motiony sound. It sounds like this. Again, the rate, like the flanger knob, controls the motion of the sound, and the depth controls the amount of the sound, which is pretty cool. Now, with the depth knob at 0, when you move the rate, nothing again happens, which is interesting. That being said, though, if you have the the rate at 0 and the depth knob here, so this isn't moving, this is becoming like a manual modulator, which you can then move with an LFO of all sorts of different shapes. Pretty cool. You can also sync the movement to the BPM, which is a good option if you want. You've also got the frequency. I'm just going to add a bit of rate here, which kind of changes the character of the phaser. It kind of determines where the central point of this movement is. The rate is the speed, the depth is how much, the frequency is kind of like the wear knob. Get some really sick effects there, as you can probably hear. The feedback, again, determines how much of the signal is going back into itself, so you get more resonances and that sort of thing. High amounts of feedback can be a bit too much, but are great for creative effects and whatnot. Low feedbacks are probably better for certain more subtle effects. And you can find a nice midpoint there depending on your tastes. And then again, phase is either determining whether it's stereo or mono or somewhere in between. 0 degrees being mono, 180 being perfectly stereo, and then you can do wherever else. Of course, you've got a mix knob there to determine how much of the dry signal you want in, and that is pretty much phaser. Again, certain sounds you may opt for the flanger because it's got a more metallic-y texture. Phasers have a bit more of a thin, airy texture, I find, so use whichever you would like to. I'm going to turn off the phaser here, and we're going to head to the chorus now, which is a similar effect, but a little bit different to the previous two. We have the movement of the chorus here, which is determined by the rate, and I'll play that so you can hear that now. A chorus is a bit thicker, though. It sounds more like a duplicate of the original sound, almost as if a choir was singing it, right? Now, the rate determines the speed of the chorus, but these two delays here determine sort of the character and movement. So we could have two delays that are, for example, offset by a few milliseconds, and that will sound different. Where you really start to hear this is when you increase the amount of rate and feedback. Very cool. And the depth is the amount of movement. Very cool. And then you've got this low pass or high pass filter switch here. Now this basically, if you turn this to 100% wet, which it's at 50% by default with this, because normally you use chorus in parallel, you don't use it 100% wet, you'll get two different sort of effects. This is just going to shape the effect of the chorus. Now, low pass filters are nice when you want a more subtle sort of movement for pads, more mellow sounds where you don't want to hear a lot of movement in the high end. High pass is good for like more basses, I would say, where you don't want the chorus movement to interact with the low end. So you could blend that in like this for a bass, where that's not going to cause issues like this would. That motion in the low end is quite intense. But with a chord, for example, you might have the low pass on a bit higher because you like that motion in the sound. Very cool option there you've got. And that's basically chorus. You blend everything with the mix. Again, play around with both delays. Sometimes shorter delays, you'll hear more of a difference at certain depth levels or feedback levels. You can get some really sick effects. Great for sort of resampling and turning into whatever you like it to. Really awesome. And that is chorus. We're going to leave that there. And while I mentioned it, if you want to save any of the effect settings individually, on this drop down here, you can actually save each of the effect settings that you like. There are some default ones here you'll find that you can load up, which is pretty cool. Some of them don't. Just an option. You can also add delay, which acts like a standard delay unit. Basically, the feedback here is how many repeats you're going to get. More feedback is more repeats. You can BPM sync it or FreeSync it. When you turn off BPM sync here, these two left and right values become millisecond values. Now you can set the left and right differently, or you can link them and then they'll move with each other, which makes it more of a mono delay. Good for creative effects, but I'm going to turn BPM sync back on, which syncs it to your host tempo. These two little values here are offsets. So this is going to offset the time a little bit. Now, if you're unlinking them, you can set different offsets for both sides. So you can get kind of a delay that as it echoes out more, the left and right slowly go out of sync, which can create some cool instability and sort of analog type effects. Sick, right? You've also got your filter of the delay. This is the response of the wet signal, the frequency response. So if you want a more muted, dubby sort of sound, you can have a very narrow sort of low end curve like this. Or you can have a full spectrum delay, which is good for certain sounds, or you could have just the high end. You can also modulate this over time, especially with longer delay tails. Really, really nice. And then you've got three modes over on the right here. You've got normal, which is a normal delay. Ping pong, which will balance between the left and the right each delay hit. Really nice. And you do get that offset still applying. And then you've got tap delay. Now, tap delay is where the first value here on the left determines the initial delay, and then the right is every delay after that. So there's like a 1/8 gap. And the longer this gap is, the more of a gap at the beginning there will be. And then this is the rest of the delay. So this is great for certain sort of moments in a song. You can do something like that. So it's a bit of a delayed delay. And then, of course, dry wet to blend it all together. I do find For most effects, you'll probably want to under 50% with the delay, but of course you can do whatever you want. It's your synth patch. Great. Again, presets for delay there. Some really good ones like classic 16th delays and whatnot. Okay, we're going to disable that. We're going to go to the compressor. One of the more, I think, commonly used parts of Serum. I like to use the multiband for basses quite a lot, which I'll get to in a second. But apart from that, acts as a pretty standard, very reliable, predictable compressor in a good sense. You've got a threshold for determining when the compression is going to engage. Now, left is less compression, right is more. Right, and you see this on the gain reduction meter over on the right here. So when we bring up the threshold, we're getting the sound turned down more. Ratio determines how much we're turning down the sound. By default, it's set to 4:1, but you can go to even up to a limiter. You can do less for more subtle effects. Really up to you. You can see less gain reduction or more depending on how much the ratio is dialed in. These two knobs together are going to determine the sound of the compression you're getting. Attack and release, how fast the compression is actually going to engage. Goes only up to 10 milliseconds, which is a little bit frustrating, but honestly, for most sounds, you're probably going to be under 10 milliseconds anyway. If you wanted sort of a click to your sound though, this is not the compressor to be using to kind of add transients to the sound. It's going to engage pretty quickly either way, so something you should know. And then you've got the release here, which is more of a traditional release. It goes up to 1 second. Again, around 1 to 200 milliseconds is going to be normal for most sounds though. And then you've got gain to compensate for that decrease in volume. I like to match it to the gain reduction roughly here. So in this case, we've got 12 dB of gain reduction. I'm going to add 12 dB of gain, which is pretty cool. You've got the mix knob then, which allows you to use the compressor in parallel. Bring in some of the uncompressed signal, which can be quite helpful for just getting some of the original texture back, as opposed to just the compressed version. Now, a word of caution, when we go and switch on this multiband button, you do not want to use the mix knob. This multiband setting does not work well in multiband mode. The mix knob basically creates phase issues. It actually thins out the sound, kind of almost like the same way a phaser does, but generally when you're doing this, this is unwanted phasing. So leave the mix on 100 whenever you switch to multiband mode, right? Now, all the same knobs apply on multiband mode, although you may want to adjust it depending on what you're going for. Right, but then you also have individual threshold controls for all three bands. So you can get more compression on the highs if you want, more on the mids, or like less on the lows, and adjust this to taste, which is a very handy thing because sometimes the default multiband setting just sounds a bit too compressed and the threshold itself doesn't quite resolve the issue. Now, this is actually the same or very similar to the OTT preset you'll find in Ableton. Xfer, who made Serum, has their own standalone OTT plugin, which this is actually based off. So it's actually based off this VST here, which is very good to know. You don't get the same flexibility as you do in the VST version of OTT, but it's good to know that it's there regardless. And that is the compressor. Really helpful. I find I use multiband particularly on dubstep and bass music basses because it really compresses the signal, makes it sound really full, gets a lot of life out of the highs, lows, and mids. So definitely something you'll see a lot of presets using in that genre or those genres. Okay, let's disable the compressor over here with that brown LED. We've got reverb, which is more of a green LED. You've got two algorithms, plate and hall. Hall to me sounds more natural in stereo. Plate's a little more metallic and a bit more mono sounding, although you can change that with this width knob. Something to know though by default. Now the settings are slightly different. You'll see that the pre-delay changes to a decay when I switch to hall, and the depth and width on plate change to a spin and spin depth. So there are two different sets of controls depending on the algorithm. The size is simply how big this reverb algorithm sounds, applies on both plate and hall. Certain sounds you may just want to add a bit of ambience, so you'll just add a little bit of size, and other sounds you'll add tons for those more vast, huge, space-like effects. Pre-delay determines how long will it be before the reverb signal actually kicks in. This is great on rhythmic effects because it can actually add a bit of space so the dry signal comes through a lot more clearly. If you have 0 pre-delay, sometimes it muddies the dry signal up a bit too much, and you may have to find yourself adjusting the mix lower when really a bit of pre-delay would just help clean things up a little bit. Very helpful to know that. Low cut and high cut acts as basically an EQ for the highs and lows. If you want more or less reverb in the highs or lows, these two knobs are your best friend. So that dampens the highs, this dampens the lows. It does, to me, sound like a filter, which is pretty cool. Damp kind of shortens the reverb in the high end, so it feels more like it cuts off almost like a moving high pass filter. So it's a little similar to the high cut, but it sounds a little more movie-ish, if that makes sense. Gonna bring this up in volume. So it kind of shortens the delay a little bit, or reverb, but it kind of doesn't sound as open. Which is really interesting. And then width is the stereoness of the reverb. Hall is very similar. Decay determines the actual length here of the sound. With, longer decay being a longer sound. You've got the low and high cut. Then spin and spin depth kind of add a bit of a chorusy effect to the reverb channel. So this is great for getting thick, lush reverbs. See there, it becomes a bit too much at too high values. Spin depth is a sort of amount of it, whereas the spin here is the rate. So again, if you're using high amounts of spin, I'd probably use lower amounts here of spin depth in general, although for creative effects, you could go wacky on both. Create some really crazy noisy textures. Lots of fun there. And yeah, a mix knob here to blend everything to taste. That is reverb. It's very simple. The two algorithms are good for different use cases. Plates are sometimes good on basses and leads. Halls are good on pads, plucks, more ethereal sounds, but you can use both on either. There's no real right or wrong here. Then you've got EQ. This acts like a very single, it's a standard 2-band EQ basically. You've got 3 different modes for both the bands. One is a low side, one is a high side. By default, it's a high and low shelf. So you've got your gain for both sides. You've got your Q, which is the narrowness of the band, and the frequency you're targeting. And so that's the default on both sides. Again, one's high, one's low. You've also got a peak on each side, which puts both EQs in the same position. The frequency on both goes up and down the whole way. So you could move this one up here and this one down here if you really wanted to, although you don't have to. And then you've got a high pass and a low pass, which is great for just dialing in an extra filter if you wanted one. This allows you to kind of access another filter apart from the filter here and the filter here, which we're going to get to in a second. So that's really helpful. You got Q on both of those. Gain obviously does nothing when you're on the filter mode because you can't really gain a filter. There's no dry wet here, of course, because it's just an EQ. You do have an on-off knob to kind of temporarily disable it if you want to without removing the view. And there are a few EQ presets here which could be worth playing around with. The Mellotronish one basically takes out the high end, but kind of boosts the high mids, which is nice for kind of old school analog effects. Sometimes it might be a bit too much, but lots of fun. And then lastly, we've got a filter here. So this is a duplicate of the filter we already covered in Serum. The only difference is you don't get the view. You can't see the phases, you can't see the spectrum there before and after. And you don't get a option between the mix and level knob here. And it does apply to everything. So you can't choose what comes into it. You can't key track it either, which is a little bit of a shame. I really wish they did add that in here, but you can't ask for everything. And so that is basically it. I'm not going to cover everything because we've already been over how the filter works and all the different types. But it is good to have 2 in conjunction at different points. It's also great to be able to move this around in the signal chain here, which is one good thing we haven't covered yet. You can actually with all of these effects, move them around so you can create your own customizable distortion or reverb first, or whatever you want first and whatever you want last. You can actually dial in here. For example, I might want to put a second filter before my distortion and then have the dimension after the distortion, and then maybe reverb and delay at the end, EQ at the end. I can dial that in. Or maybe I want to put the compressor last, you know, to let that reverb. Yeah, that's a sick sort of effect. Maybe I want to do that. You know, this is where the sound design possibilities get really, really crazy. So that's one of my favorite parts of effects. Use these in combination. The one piece of advice I would use here is don't feel the need to use all of these all the time. You know, in most cases, I'll probably be using 2 effects. Some patches will maybe use 5 or 6. Some maybe use 1. Some, I might not even use the effects. I might only do everything in the oscillator section. So feel free to keep that in mind when you're doing effects. And of course, you do have the option to add effects outside of Serum in your host DAW to further beef out or transform the sound. Okay, so let's talk about envelopes and LFOs and the modulation section in general. We will dive into the matrix specifically up here in the next section. That does tie into what we're about to talk about though. The 2 main types of modulators you are going to use are these envelopes here and LFOs. Now they are similar, but they are different. An envelope, if you're not familiar, is a movement using 4 values: attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now in Serum, by default, envelope 1 affects the global volume. This is just the way it is, and this is the way a lot of synths function. Now, what does that mean? Well, the attack, for example, will determine how long the sound takes to engage. I'm actually just going to disable some of these effects here so we can hear this more clearly. And let's play the sound. Notice how it comes in straight away. What if we didn't want that to happen? Well, we'd bring the attack up, right? That is a very helpful way to get certain textures. Attack in long form is great for pads, certain effects, sweeps, rises. Shorter attacks are good for basses, leads, keys, and stuff like that. Sometimes you just want a little bit of attack, but not fully starting at the beginning, or sometimes you literally just want it to come in straight away. Sometimes you may just want like 0.5 milliseconds just so that there's no clicking at the beginning of the sound, because that can occur. Now there is a hold functionality. I'm going to come back to that in a second because it is kind of a different one to normal and how a lot of other synths function. The next one we have is the decay and sustain. Now there's a reason these 2 are paired together because they do kind of interact. I'm actually going to start with sustain, which determines once the sound has reached its maximum volume, what point will it drop to? So if I bring the sustain down here, the sound hits the attack straight away, and then it brings it down in volume to 22.6 dB. Bring that up to compensate on the master here. Now, the decay determines how long it will take to reach that point. So if I wanted a longer sort of decay, it still gets quiet, it just takes longer to get there. Now, I can bring the sustain down to negative infinity, which is silence, which is good for certain types of sounds. So I'm still holding down the note now, and it's gone to silence, which can be good, but sometimes we do want to hold down the note even if it just gets a bit quieter. That way I'm continuing to hold it down and it sounds like I can hold it down really good. The last thing is release. This is when I actually let go of the note on the keyboard, how long it will take to fade to silence. Now normally it's pretty instant, right? So I'm going to hold down the key. Holding, holding, holding. Drops, instantly gone. With a longer release, holding, 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 fades out. And you can get these epically long releases on certain types of like pads and drones. Really cool. By the way, if you do want to see it locked to the time, you saw the envelope kind of went out of screen there. We can press lock and it will automatically adjust the length of the view of the envelope to the end point here, which is pretty nice. Now, as well, you've also got this sort of 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 4 second, 5 second view, which actually determines how long these points are. So we can actually move them on here, and you'll see the values here. The decay and sustain values will adjust as I move it along this view. You can also do this with the attack. I could do this with the release, which is good for visually seeing how this is updating over time. Okay, so that's also really good. Now, if you turn off lock, you've also got this view over here to zoom in and out. You can scroll up and down on. Very helpful. If you want to kind of go out to 10 seconds to see what it would be like if you went to 10 seconds, you get a more objective idea visually of what's actually going on. Pretty cool. Now, I said I'd come back to this hold knob. The hold knob is basically, once the attack has hit, how long is it going to stay at the max volume before the decay kicks in? So if I want to hold it down for a second before the decay hits, right, I could do this. And notice that little blurry ball kind of go through the envelope. Right, so it goes up to max volume, holds for a bit, and then goes down. Good for certain sounds. I personally don't use hold a lot, but it can be good just to get a little bit more fullness out of a sound before it decays. Sometimes I might have like 100 milliseconds or something. It actually can be a good mixing technique to allow certain sounds to cut through the mix a little more, even if they are like a plucky sound. Something to think about. Now you've got 3 envelopes. Now envelope 2 and 3 by default don't do anything. Envelope 1's the only one that actually affects something by default. The rest of them, you have to actually drag and modulate things with them. This is affecting the volume, but for example, we can modulate any parameter in Serum. Any knob you see here pretty much can be modulated with one of these envelopes, whether it is envelope 1 or you create a new one on 2 or 3. To show this, I'm actually going to move envelope 1 onto the cutoff of the filter here, which by the way is a very common way to use an envelope, is on the filter cutoff of a low pass or a high pass of some sort. Now you hear, as I move this, or as I play a new note, should I say, it actually moves the cutoff. I can move the cutoff and have more of a movement here. Very cool. And now this blue ring, I can actually move with my mouse to determine the movement. I can make it go down, for example, which is not what I want in this case, but I usually want to make it open up as it opens up and then go down again. Now, of course, as I mentioned, I can shape a new envelope here. I'm going to lock this one. I can make it move to something different, like, for example, specifically the amount of drive or something on the low pass and peak filter here. So that's just going to give it an extra bit of beef at the filter stage, which is cool. I could then say apply this to the wavetable position, which would not do anything unless I actually have a wavetable with movement in it. Moves that there, as you can see, even if we go to the 3D mode. Very helpful to see. Now you can see this little number here determines how many sources are being modulated. Now the 1 here is not true. It's actually always going to be 1 plus the master volume, because we're modulating the master volume by default and then also the filter cutoff. The cool thing is you can either right click on the envelope here. You can bypass temporarily the destinations you want to be modulating. This isn't going to remove the modulation, but it will gray out, as you can see there. And then you can re-enable it by just unchecking it there, or you can bypass all destinations. So if I go here where there's multiple destinations we're modulating, I can bypass all of them. They will all go gray. And then I can turn off and on specific ones too. This is great when you're A/Bing certain changes to your sound, which you're not 100% sure on. You maybe just want to kind of temporarily mute it without fully committing to removing that modulation you may have worked so hard to dial in. And then, of course, at the bottom here, you've got remove all destinations, which is pretty good if you just want to stop this modulating everything. So you can just remove that all and boom, that's now gone there. And the drive is now gone too. So that is good. Now, the cool thing is you can actually get access to 3 envelopes, which is pretty handy. Honestly, you won't find many uses for more than 3 in my use cases and my experience. That is different with LFOs though, which we will get to in a second. Now, one quick mention. The sustain on envelope 2 and 3 is going to be measured in a percentage value, whereas here it's measured in a dB value. Again, that's because envelope 1 changes the master volume, whereas envelope 2 and 3 don't necessarily change any volume until you map it to something. And that could be the filter, the wavetable position, the level of noise, the pitch of the noise, any parameter in Serum whatsoever. And this is really where the power comes in of Serum. So definitely something worth exploring. Now, in my honest opinion, the LFOs have a little bit more power than the envelopes, and I actually use LFOs as envelopes sometimes, as I'll soon cover. So what do I mean? Well, there's 4 LFOs here. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. So it's not an oscillator in the same sense that oscillator A, oscillator B, and the sub-oscillator all generate sound. The low frequency means it's operating at a low pitch, so low in fact that it's not really audible, and we only use it as a way to move other sounds around. So we actually use this to make a movement. It cycles through over and over and over again. So by default in Serum, all of the LFOs are set to a triangle wave, which is a very up and down movement. So say we map this to the filter cutoff. We can go ahead and do that, and then it'll go up and down, right? Forever, which is very, very cool. Now, again, you can map these and use the same mapping features as the same as the envelopes we just covered. But the LFOs, as I think, have a lot more flexibility and use case in Serum. Now, you can actually select from a bunch of preset shapes here, which come with Serum. You can actually import third-party ones as well. I haven't done that a lot. The cool thing is, one of my favorite, more recent features in Serum is that you can go oscillators A and B to the LFO. So if I liked the shape of this oscillator here, I could just grab that, and now that's my new LFO shape. And obviously the different shapes are going to determine the types of movement you're going to get. Now, I find simple shapes are good for faster movements, but more complex shapes are better for slower movements. So we'll play around with the rate in a second and get that. Now, if you select one from the folder here and you press Alt on your keyboard and click it, it will cycle through these presets for you very quickly. Very handy little piece of advice there. That's a bit of a hack. Now, when you're drawing in shapes, by default, you can double click on this view here to add in your own points, and you left click on them to kind of move them around. Now, you can actually see this grid in the background there, which if you have Alt selected, it will actually, well, snap to the grid, right? Very helpful. I'm holding Alt now while I do this, and then when you don't have Alt selected, it will move freely. So if you're wanting more like rhythmic effects, it can be good to use Alt. The cool thing is as well, it snaps not only horizontally, but vertically. So you can get like steps like this way too. Very helpful. You can change the grid to be, for example, if you wanted it to be like a 12, if you're doing like pitch effects, you could do something like this, where you basically double click, boom, you move up one step by one step. Very cool. Up to you if you want to do this or not. You know, you can get some pretty cool effects either way. Anyway, that's the grid. Very helpful to know. You've also got 3 modes here. Now, by default, the mode is off, which kind of seems a little counterintuitive. What does off mean? Well, off just means it functions like a normal LFO. Basically, it just follows your host's clock, and it will play through when you play a new note. However, if you're playing in your host tempo, in your host DAW, it will actually sync to wherever the marker is in your host DAW. So if you've got a time synced LFO, like a quarter note here, and you're at half a quarter note through, the LFO will start halfway through. Now, if you didn't want that to happen and you just wanted it to happen every time you play a new note, that it would start from the beginning no matter where it happens in your host tempo or your host DAW, select trig mode. That's going to make sure that it always starts over from the beginning whenever a new note is played. And then if you want it to just cycle through once, so it doesn't repeat, you select envelope mode. This allows you to use it in the same way you would use an envelope, where it only re-triggers every time a note is played. It comes into Serum, and it only goes through once. These envelopes here, for example, do not repeat themselves over and over again, which is really interesting. I use envelope mode a lot to get custom envelope shapes. You know, you can draw in your exact shape you're not stuck to the confines of attack and release and decay and stuff. You can add in your own curves here, like you can on the envelope, which is actually something I didn't mention. This little middle, like sort of open circle controls the curves of any of the stages. That goes for attack and release and decay. So you can control the curves there, which is pretty cool. And yeah, have your own envelope. Lots and lots of fun. I'm just going to bring the release back here a bit. Now, apart from that, you've got a few other features here. BPM sync turns the rate knob into either a BPM synced interval or a free-form hertz value. Now, I'm going to map this to say the... let's do the wavetable position. Why not? That doesn't actually make a huge difference. Let's maybe do like a warping mode, maybe like bend plus or something. Now it's quite fast and it's on envelope mode, so we're not really hearing it. I'm going to turn it on trig. Seeing a bit of movement there now, right? Might actually go sync. Let's go even slower. Very interesting movements. Not something I would super use in a track. But BPM allows that free synced thing, which is good for more organic effects. Otherwise, you can just have a time synced one. Lots of fun there. Anchor, again, basically this just anchors the LFO's position to the global song position in the track. So for example, is it just going to kind of constantly wander, or is it going to be synced to the beat position where Ableton or FL or whatever DAW you're using is synced to? So if you want something that's more freeform when it's playing, this is good. Now, one thing to mention, when it's in trig mode, it's going to do that anyway. This is probably more if the mode is off. But so most of the time you just want this on. I don't really find many use cases for turning it off personally. Now, you've also got triplet and dot. When BPM is activated, this is going to add more options to the rate here. By default, when these are off, you've only got your standard 1 second or half, quarter, 8, 16, 32, 64. You do go up to really fast, or 256 is the quickest interval. So it's pretty crazy what you can do with Serum. Don't find that super usable, but it is a lot of fun to play around with because why not? But yeah, the triplet and dot get sort of other rhythmic effects, which is nice. You can get like a dotted quarter note. Very cool, especially if you have your host tempo on. Very nice. Rise kind of adds a bit of an attack to the delay, so it doesn't engage straight away. So it sounds like this. So if I wanted to say it come in over a 2-bar phrase, that sync and wavetable position movement become more pronounced as I hold down the note longer, which is pretty cool for more gradual LFO effects. Sometimes you don't want it to come in straight away. This is great for adding vibrato. Some crazy sort of effects there. I'm going to remove that from the pitch of those two. I'd probably do this on the master pitch, which we'll get to in a second. And then you've got delay, which is just simply no movement to suddenly there's movement, which is good for certain effects. Now, I believe how this works is the delay acts first and then the rise comes in, which is pretty cool. And then you've got a smoothing, which basically, if you've got a lot of jagged, sort of sharp edges on your LFO, this is going to smooth those out to make the movement more natural sounding. Great for organic sounds. On 100% smooth there, you can see it hardly moves. See it moving there a bit. Really interesting, right? Now that's really cool. Couple of cool features. You can right click on the view here. You can actually have this shift key function, which is good for adding in step sequencer effects. By default, I think it's set to either flat or ramp down. If I hold shift and draw across the grid, you get steps. I'm going to code ramp down. Really fun. You can then also go ramp up. Again, changing the grid here will change the thickness or the rhythmic intervals. Really, really fun. You can select multiple points and move them at the same time, which is really cool for just different modulation stuff. You can do that where you move this up, just on its own. There's so many different cool tools you can do. Now, if you're on trigger or envelope mode, you can actually select or right click on any point and set this as the new starting point. This especially works well if you've got the rise and delay turned down so you can see what's going on. This will now be where the LFO triggers from, as opposed to the actual first point in the LFO, which is great if you're halfway through designing an LFO and you're like, actually, I want it to start here. Again, it works on trig as well. Very helpful. And then you've also got on envelope mode, you can select any point here and select the loopback point. So I'm actually going to go to the start here, make this the start point. I'm going to make this here the loopback point. And you'll see when I play this LFO through now, it keeps going back to the loopback point. This is great. For example, if I wanted to do this on the first LFO here, I'm going to leave the start point at the beginning, but I'm going to set the loopback point here. Really nice way to add some cool modulations and use the LFOs in more creative and less predictable ways. So I love doing that. You can also right click and flip the entire envelope either vertically or horizontally. Really fun. I'm going to put that back to where we originally had it. And that pretty much covers over all the LFO tools. Now, one cool thing you can do is if you hold Alt on your keyboard, you click and you drag the LFO over to another one, you will create a third LFO. And then you can modulate that, change the settings slightly differently, and move it to your heart's content. Pretty cool. Now, while we're here, we'll also cover the velocity and note settings. So this is an XY graph that basically determines, hey, when a note at a certain velocity, which is how hard the note is pressed on the keyboard, so that's a pretty quiet note, versus a hard note, up in those ranges, what is the relationship of that? For example, I want most of my notes to kind of go up towards the hard end no matter how hard I press. You'll see that this curve pushes them all towards the top in terms of the value. Whereas if I have it down here, even hard notes that I press will be pushed down towards the bottom, which means it's going to yield softer results. Now, by default, velocity doesn't do anything in Serum, which is actually a deliberate design so that every note you play is the same volume. Other synths will have the velocity by default mapped to the overall volume of each note, which is going to mean that each note kind of feels more human. Now, if you want to do this, you have to add it manually, either through clicking and dragging it, say on the level, like this. I'm going to remove that for now. Or you can go into the matrix and set this, which was what we'll cover in a second. This is the same with the actual note value. So lower notes on the keyboard will be down here, and then higher notes will be up here. And so on. Right. And this is cool. I like to map this personally to like fine pitch and stuff, so you get this kind of more analog instability. So higher notes are slightly sharper, lower notes are slightly flatter. But it's really cool to be able to map that so that different notes on the keyboard react differently to different parameters. Lots of fun. Not a lot of presets use these, but I do find it quite helpful for very analog, sort of expressive, organic sounds. Now as well, this mod here represents the mod wheel, which is this little thing down the bottom here on Serum. A lot of things by default, again, depending on the preset, will be mapped to the mod wheel. And if you like performing live with Serum, or at least playing things in with using the mod wheel, which is what a lot of people like to do, you can map this to something. So maybe, for example, I could map this to the filter cutoff, and then it moves it like that as I play my mod wheel physically on the keyboard here, right? So that's really cool for those expressive live performance things. I'm going to remove that for now. As well here, you've also got 4 macros. And so these macros are really powerful just to control multiple movements at once. Now we'll go into the advanced uses of macros in the matrix section, which I'll cover next. But to really quickly set up a macro, all you need to do is grab a parameter let's say I want it to be the pitch of the noise, and I also want it to be the resonance of the filter for whatever reason. Now when I move this macro, those two things are going to move together with one knob. This is great when you go into your host DAW and you actually map it to a automation lane or whatever, because then you can make the sound move in real time with your song. You can draw in your own curves and whatnot, and that's where macros really shine. You can double click on the name here and rename it. I would call this Noise Reso, or whatever you want to call it. And you've got up to 4 different macros for different things. So one could be filter cutoff, one could be reverb and delay, one could be distortion, one could be a crazy combination of parameters that you call donk or something if it adds more donk to it, you know? You can get really creative, and notice how presets use these, and you can actually again go into the matrix and see where they are mapped to, which is what we'll cover in a second. All right, now while we're here, we're going to just quickly talk about the voicing section. I'm going to do this right before the matrix. Now, voicing is very simple, but it's very important. By default, your voicing in Serum is what's called polyphonic. This means I can play many notes at the same time. In fact, this poly number here determines how many notes can I play at the same time. So for example, can I play 2 notes at the same time? Well, if I try and play 3, it will start to cut off one of them. So if I have it on 2 here, so I played 2 lower notes, and then the third one ended the last note that I played, or sorry, should I say the first note. This is great if you're wanting to save on CPU, but 2, if you don't want your synth to play too many sounds at once. If you just want, like for example, if you're playing triads, so 3-note chords, you may want to make sure that that's set to 3, so only 3 notes ever play at the same time. And it snaps off any older notes, which is very handy. Now, 8 is on by default to give you the flexibility to do really complex chords, right? But you've also got this mono button here. Now, this basically sets the poly to 1 by default, but it actually grays it out here. This means you can only play 1 note at the same time, which is very handy for basses, certain types of leads as well, and any sound you need to just have 1 note coming through. Very helpful. Now, where does legato come in? Well, what legato does, basically, it means that you can play 1 note, and consecutive notes you play while having the original note held will not re-trigger envelope 1 or any of the envelopes for that matter, including LFOs that have envelope mode turned on. This is great if you're wanting a smooth sort of effect from your synth. For example, a lot of like disco-y soulful leads will use this. And then you'll release the note and play a new one when you want that envelope to start again. This allows you to get some smooth movements without it sounding really dorky and having to restart the envelope every time. Like that. So that's the difference between no legato and legato. Now, when you have legato enabled, you can also use the Porter time, which is this little knob down here, which is going to add a bit of a slide. It actually works with legato on or off, so I can turn it off. Now there's a bit of a pitch slide between each note I play, and the higher the value, the more obvious and long the pitch slide will be. Great for those funkier sort of soulful sounds out of your synth. Great for certain types of basses, anywhere where you need smoothness and like wonkiness to sounds. Really cool. Again, it works on legato too, though. Again, because we've got quite a quiet sustain there, you're not going to hear it a lot. But if I bring that up, that last note I played on its own there. Now, this always button is an interesting one. Basically, if you have always on, no matter if you have a previous note held or not, it's always going to slide no matter where on the keyboard you are. I'm playing a note 3 octaves away from each other there, and that's sliding every time I play that, which is really cool. You can then also set the portamento to scaled mode, which is basically, it's going to move it differently. So the rate here, the millisecond value, you click on it, it'll scale this depending on how high or low you're playing. Now, basically, higher notes will move faster, I believe. The reason for this is basically you want lower notes to have this more slow movement, but a high note you want to be faster in movement. You can, of course, tweak this to be different, though. For example, if I want all my notes to kind of move relatively fast, right, I can curve it up like that. But if I want them all to kind of be slow, yeah, it's like lower notes move really slow there. So, sorry, it was the opposite of what I was saying. So low is most notes towards the bottom are going to move slow, but everything else will move fast. And this will be most notes move slow. Or not, mate. I'm very confused here. I can't remember which one is which. I don't use this control a lot, to be honest. And obviously, the larger the value here, the more curve, the curve is going to move depending on this Porter value. Right, so there you go. Again, play around with it. Certain sounds it'll sound good on. I don't use this a lot, but it's really good to have regardless. Couple of last things to notice here as well. On the left side of this keyboard, you've got this pitch bend, which is this knob here. Again, it corresponds to a MIDI pitch bend. So if you've got a MIDI controller, it will move that there. As you can see, I'm moving it on my keyboard. This range determines how much the pitch bend will affect the notes up or down in semitones. So for example, by default, it's 2. So if I play a C here, I'm going to turn off Porter. It's still going. I'm going to go. Turn off legato there. Make sure mono is off as well for the time being. My keyboard, for some reason, is messing up with the pitch bend, but it only moves it up or down by 2 at the moment. We could extend this or shorten it, so we could go for a full octave either way, for example, which is sometimes cool for like riser type effects. Very cool. So that's very handy to play with, especially if you can modulate that in your synth, which you may want to do. And that is pretty much it for this range here. Again, we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover in terms of LFOs, envelopes, and the voicing. So next, we're going to move on to the modulation matrix. One thing I just wanted to briefly mention is if you see this 0 out of 32, this is going to be the polyphony times the max amount of voices you're going to see on the detune. So for example, here, we're not using any detune, but we are using 4 oscillators, right? So oscillator A, B, sub, and noise. So 8 times 4 is 32. Every note we play is using 4 voices, and sometimes they are overlapping because we're back to polyphonic mode. The maximum voices we can get is 32. Now, this is really good to conceptualize that we're actually generating 32 voices from the synth, which is a lot of sound. So if I was to increase the unison here, you're going to see this go up even higher. Sometimes you can get up to really crazy values like 256 if you use a lot of unison. Here we got 272 voices, which is a crazy amount. So be careful when you're using crazy amounts of unison, like 16, for example. Okay, let's go to the matrix here. Now, a lot of the things we've seen here, or lots of the things we've modulated with the envelopes, with the LFOs, if we had modulated the micros, which we have, you'll see all that show up here on the modulation matrix. Now, this is like kind of your home base for all modulations you're doing in the synth, which is helpful to see where the movements are. And if you play a note, you'll see the modulation visually here on this little yellow square, as well as visually up and down the actual parameter on this orange line with that blue indicator. Very, very helpful. Now, you can actually create different and adjust the modulations here in the matrix, which is pretty helpful. Personally, I still prefer to adjust things on the knobs just because I find it a bit easier visually, but it is helpful to see things all at once here. If you're trying to figure out why there's so many movements in my patch, this is the place you want to come to. Now, you'll see this list here with a scroll bar to see how many modulations you've got. You'll have 2 main things, a source and a destination. So the source is an envelope, an LFO, or something else. And the destination is what it's modulating. So for example, I dragged this LFO1 onto the filter cutoff. I can see here envelope 1 is the source, and destination is the filter cutoff. And here we have the amount of modulation we added on this little blue ring here, indicated by this orange bar here. Very helpful to know. Now, one thing to notice is that at the moment, we have the modulation from envelope 1 set to the filter cutoff in bypass mode, which basically means it's not actually doing it. I'd have to actually, go in here and set this to not bypass, which is this star. But if I have it bypassed, which is really interesting, it basically determines whether it's actually going to move it. So if I go and put all of these on bypass, you'll hear there's no movement in the sound. Right, so we should move all that. But if I go back and turn them all on, and you can invert the modulation here, which is really interesting with that star invert. It basically does the opposite or backwards movement to whatever is set here. We have the original movements back, right? You can also set the type here to bipolar, which is what I just turned it on there, or unipolar. Again, a lot of modulations will be different depending on the type of parameter it is. For example, I dragged the noise reso onto the pitch before. This is a bipolar because you can see the blue ring goes either side of the central point of the knob. But on the resonance here, you can see it's unipolar because it's only going one side of the knob. Again, Shift-Alt will turn them from unipolar to bipolar, but you can also do it here. So if I do this on the LFO, if I do this on LFO 2, or sorry, should I say macro 1 filter reso, if I click that here, now you'll see that's on bipolar there. Pretty handy. Right, so that's how we've adjusted that. Now, this is, again, pretty much it. Now, do you have a curve, kind of like we talked about with the portamento scale down here, where you can adjust the curve of the modulation. So this could skew it to one side. So, for example, if we did this on something that actually is modulating the filter cutoff like LFO 1, it's going to scale basically the whole LFO up. So all these points in reality will actually move up higher towards the top or down bottom. So it'll scale them all down towards the bottom, making it really plucky and deep sounding, which I think is really cool just to fine tune your modulation in your synth. Sometimes you don't get it 100%. This is like that final check. The other cool thing about the matrix, though, is that you can actually set sources and destinations that you can't visually see in Serum normally. For example, if I wanted LFO 1 here to adjust, say, the overall volume of my entire synth, I can't actually just drag LFO 1 onto the master up here, which is where our master volume is. So how would I go about doing that? Well, if I go LFO 1 here on the source, select that from the drop down, which has all of the possible sources you could use, by the way. Some of them we haven't covered yet. We will get there. We have a bunch of destinations we could map that to. Again, a lot of these are ones you'll see visually, like oscillator A, volume, pan, coarse pitch, etc. All the noise oscillator stuff. One thing you won't see, for example, is the noise oscillator's fine pitch. You'll only see their pitch. This is where you can add like very subtle wobble to a noise oscillator. For example, though, in the global, you have the master tune, which is all the pitches of all the oscillators. You have the amplitude and the chaos 1 and 2 rate. Again, we'll cover chaos in a second. So if I wanted to adjust the overall volume of my synth's output, I would actually go to the global amp. I would then move this up. Right, now that is adjusting the overall volume of my synth. Now I can make that unipolar, or I can make it bipolar like it was. Very handy to know. Again, it's probably helpful on bipolar in this case because it actually mutes the whole synth, which is pretty much what we want. And that is the power of this this section. You can actually see everything in a list as well. So maybe it indicates to you, oh, maybe I didn't think of modulating that. Maybe I could also do that while kind of considering the overall effect of what your modulations are doing. It gives you cool ideas. Now, by default, there'll be this constant 3 dashes. This is basically no modulation. So if you're wanting to disable it, you can, instead of pressing bypass, just set it back to constant, which is really handy to know. We've also got LFO buses. Now, we have to talk about LFO buses, which I kind of deliberately left to this section because it's a little bit more complicated and I just didn't want to kind of overload you too much. But we're going to go into LFO buses now, which basically allow you to, if you, again, right-click on any of these points, you'll see here, you can modulate the X and Y parameters, which is very, very helpful. And by default, there'll only be one LFO bus, but if you create and use one, the next time you go to do this, for example, over here, I'll set this to LFO bus 1, and I'll modulate it with, let's say, LFO 3. Next time I do this, I have an LFO bus 2 option where I can select it, right? Now, this actually then shows up in the matrix. So LFO 3 is now modulating LFO bus 1, right? Now, if I go here and select this point to LFO bus 1, you'll see basically these 2 points will be moved by LFO 3. Right, we're going to slow this right down, or speed it right up, sorry. And you can't get a super good visual for it. I'm actually going to reset this to a basic triangle just so we can see what's going on. And we see that the point of the X is moved towards the left. Right, we actually can modulate the Y as well. So if I go back up here and modulate Y with LFO bus 1, we're basically getting this cool movement. I'm going to put this on trigger mode. All right. Then we can see the movement of the LFO bus, right? This is great for adjusting parameters in your LFOs. For example, maybe you only want the top point of the LFO, like here. Maybe you want that to be modulated in LFO bus 2 by a macro. Let's go to macro 4. I could actually wanted to do the Y position, so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to uncheck LFO bus 2 from the X. Now macro 4. Actually, did I leave it? Yeah, so I have to turn that off. Make sure that I have unassigned that point. I may have to delete it. I can't remember how to unassign an LFO bus, which is actually frustrating. But you'll see moving macro 4 closes down the LFO a bit, which is very helpful for adding movements to your LFOs. It's quite a new feature, and it's quite a lot of fun. And so as you can see here, there are up to 16 LFO buses, again, depending on how many you want to use in your LFOs here. But multiple points can be assigned to the same LFO bus if you want the same movement to apply to it. Now, you can select multiple things to apply to the same destination. So, for example, I could have 2 LFOs controlling LFO bus 1, which is something you'd have to go into here and select, because once you've assigned an LFO bus, you can't go again and choose a new parameter. You have to manually add it in the matrix here. Now we've got 2 things moving LFO bus 1, which is fascinating. We can get some pretty crazy movement. You'll see there when I selected LFO 7, it created all these new LFOs. That's what I was talking about when every new LFO you create creates a new one, and you have a maximum of 8. Pretty handy. It does take up more visual real estate. Very helpful to play around with. Now, we'll have to also talk about auxiliary sources. So for example, if LFO 7 is modulating the LFO bus 1 here, what if I wanted to control the amount of that movement with something else, like say a macro? Well, would I go here and select macro 1 to LFO bus? Would I select macro 1 to LFO 7? Well, actually, LFO 7 isn't an option here. I can only select the LFO 7 rate, because that's the only thing in an LFO apart from an LFO bus that can actually be modulated. So how do I basically adjust this relationship with a macro? Well, auxiliary sources are how. You'll see here, if I go and select, let's say macro 3, right? Macro 3 by default will be at 100%, and the movement will remain the same. But if I bring macro 3 down, the movement stops, right? And I bring it up. Macro 3 is basically a gatekeeper for how much LFO 7 is controlling our LFO bus, which is great because maybe we don't want the full-on effect all the time, which is great. There's many use cases for this, and macros I find are generally a pretty good auxiliary source. You can set it to any of the normal sources, except macros, are basically a manual kind of limiter on how much movement you get. So you can go crazy, and let's say we could, use an LFO to control the movement of a movement to a destination, and that's where it gets pretty meta. But it's a lot of fun to play around with auxiliary sources. Again, macros are pretty much the main use case, in my opinion, for auxiliary sources. And then you can also adjust that relationship for how much the auxiliary source controls the main modulation with this curve here. So for example, high values will keep the curve going, will keep the modulation going until you get right down the bottom. And then it will stop, and then vice versa. It'll only engage right at the end. Or in this case, not at all. Oh, wrong macro. There we go. Very helpful. And then at the end of it, you've got this output control, which scales all of the movement, all the modulation back. So if you had all of these mod matrix outputs at 0, no modulation would occur. So this just allows you to control the amount of movement a little bit. If anything's being a bit too unruly, you can just tuck that down there and control things. Right? You can actually get some really cool results doing that. Now, this is pretty much how it works. Now, you can actually, I believe, you can't sort by the different sources and curves and whatever, which is a bit of a shame. What you can do over here, though, is click this drop down and do it. So, for example, I can sort by source, so it'll kind of order things a lot nicer. Or I can sort by destination, which will put all the destinations that are the same. So, envelope 2 and LFO 2, I'm modulating A's wavetable position. It will sort it nice and visually for me there. The cool thing is, you can also lock this modulation matrix. We'll get to this in a second. It's the same thing as the locking effect racks and saving it chains and whatever, where if you switch presets, this modulation matrix will not change. So this will actually take the old preset or the old synth patches modulation matrix and apply it to a new preset, which is great for kind of creating hybrid versions of presets. I actually really, really enjoy this. So that is that there. Now, you also can do a really quick few things here. You can create a vibrato, which is going to basically pick any unused LFO and create a pitch vibrato effect, which is then going to be controlled by the mod wheel. So if we go ahead and do that, you'll see here, we just used LFO 4 to adjust the master tune, which is one of those global settings we talked about. And this is being modulated by the mod wheel. So the mod wheel is acting as a macro, sort of as an auxiliary source. So if I play a note, as I move the mod wheel, we get some vibrato in the sound, which is a very handy way to do that very quickly. You can also do what we were talking about earlier, which is map the velocity to the master amp, which is where the velocity will affect the loudness of all the notes being played. So quieter notes are quieter, and louder notes or harder notes are louder. Turn down that mod wheel there. Very handy to know that. Super fun. And that is pretty much the mod matrix. Again, it looks complicated. It's not as complicated as it seems, though, once you kind of understand these basic things, really. That's it. You just, as many modulations as you have, you can control them all here. So come back and visit this page as you're designing your presets and adjust things to fine-tune them. So next up is the global settings in Serum, which is accessible via this top toolbar where you press global. There's a few other cool things that are a bit more advanced, and we'll just tackle them all now. So the first thing you need to know is there's 2 chaos oscillators. These are basically random LFOs, you can think of them, that don't have any sort of pattern to them. They are slightly different in how they function. They're slightly different movements, but you can use these as mod sources in the matrix. If we come down to the matrix, you can select chaos 1 or 2. And this is going to add random movement to something. For example, I like getting chaos 1, let's say, adding it to our master tune, adjusting in the matrix a little bit. And you'll just see it do sort of random movements like that, right? Very cool for adding a little bit of pitch instability at like a 1 value. Really, really lots of fun there. And then, yeah, Chaos 2 is very similar. It just has a slightly different movement. For example, if I exaggerate it, I feel like Chaos 2 is a little more jumpy, but that might just be me. You can control the rate of both of them here to make them shorter or faster, slower or faster, should I say. BPM sync will sync them to the tempo, so the movement is a little less chaotic, even though it still is going to be random. And then you've also got mono, which means that the modulation is going to be different for the left and right side. So if you're modulating something where, for example, there's differences between the left and the right, mono will keep it so that it's just one movement, which is pretty helpful. And sample and hold makes it more of a blocky movement. So as you see here, when I go back to the matrix, every new note actually moves it rather than it constantly moving, which is very helpful for, each note just having a bit of pitch instability, but only changing when a new note is triggered. I like using it for that personally, but there's a ton of use cases where these can come in, and you get two of them. Again, they're slightly different, so you can use two different sets of sort of random modulation in your synth. Lots of fun there. Okay, so let's move on to unison. Unison is applying to the unison settings on oscillator A. So for the time being, I'm just going to add only oscillator A and add some 7 voices, right? It's actually a really sick sound. Right, so we've got this here. Now, by default, the range here determines basically how much is this detune knob going to move these voices away from each other. By default, it's 2 semitones either way, but we can up that to, say, an octave, which is going to get really crazy detune effects. Especially great for atonal sort of crazy weird sounds, right? Because this is basically going to create what's called a whole tone scale because it's 7 voices an octave apart. We're basically evenly splitting all the notes and creates like a really cool effect. Now you can use this central knob to control the same effect on both oscillators A on the left here and then B on the right. If you're wanting to make sure these same settings are applying to both, use this central slider. The width here is the stereo width of each of these voices, which by default, it's going to be panning the further ones out left or right? If we wanted them to be more central, though, we could bring this width down. Right now, the width is kind of narrowing the feel of the synth until we get to no stereo width whatsoever. So if you are not wanting the unison effect to add stereo image, you're wanting to keep things mono, it'd be great to bring down the width to 0. This is great for certain bass sound design purposes. I find myself using it for that. But again, sometimes you just want to leave it on 100. Now, the warp settings here is going to apply a different warp setting. So in this case, sync whatever this is set to different detunes. So if I wanted to add a bit of texture, I could do, say, 70 or something like that. So the sync is going to basically have moved for each of the voices. Now, if I turn off the filter, you're going to just get a slightly different texture. You're basically getting different values of that per of one of these, which is cool for just variation in your sound design. Again, you can control the middle slider, and you can move it negative with this one. So if your warp marker, or sorry, should I say warp knob position was in the middle, you can move it sort of either way, depending on what you want there. I don't find myself using it a ton, but it is great for sound design variation, absolutely. You've got the same for the wavetable position, and you can go negative or positive. So each of the voices will have a different wavetable position, which is very handy. Then you've got this interesting control here, which is this unison stack. Now, by default, it's off, but what you can do is actually create different types of unison stacks, which is going to add, say, different octaves of unison effects. I'm going to bring back the range here back to 2 for the unison range. We're going to bring the detune down. I'm actually going to go back into the matrix and just disable the chaos oscillator. And we're going to listen to what this stack does to the main synth, right? See, there's like higher sort of octave detune effects, right? This is great on lower sounds. It's great for Hoover basses, if anyone is familiar with what they are. Then you've got this +7, which is adding like a fifth above. Great for getting sort of harmonic richness in sounds. You got plus times 2 and 3 with that. You can go up pretty high. Great for sound design. Again, there's some really cool textures you can get from this. Then you get center minus 12, which basically kind of just moves the center down 12 semitones, so it's kind of lower feeling. Pretty cool. And then you got 24, which again is moving that central voice, the yellow one there, down 2 octaves. So it's kind of similar to the I don't think I can show you all the settings at once. It's kind of similar to the times 2, but it's like the opposite direction, if that makes sense. Very interesting results. And then lastly, you've got the different modes of unison. So by default, it's linear, meaning all of these voices are separated the same amount. But you can do, say, super, which is going to kind of get them further away the further out they are. You can do exponential, which is they get closer the further out they are. Or sorry, actually, no. It's even more intense than super. What I meant to say was invert is the inversion of that. So you can see that the further they are out, the closer they are together. They all just sound different, by the way. And then random is one of my favorites for just chaotic unison effects. They all move every single note that's played. Great for analog effects again, because it's kind of that pitch instability coming into play. So use these when you're playing with unison just to fine-tune things. A lot of sound design fun there. Let's go through these preferences really quickly. They're pretty simple in most cases. This is just setting the default waveform overview type to 2D or 3D. If it's on, it's going to be 3D, which means that anytime you load up a new oscillator, it's going to be on this view, or any synth patch for that matter. You can hide the piano keys if you want to, which means these bottom keys will be kind of gone. Again, this would be having to restart the synth to see that. You can limit polyphony to 1 note of any number. If MIDI is coming in from multiple different sources, say we're playing 3 C3 notes, this being on means that only 1 C3 can play at the same time, which is probably what you want in most cases. So I just leave that on. I recommend leaving show help tooltips, because even after using Serum for like 10 years or however long it's been out now, I still find myself hovering over things and kind of just looking at what the tooltips say. It does take a while to show up, so it's not like it's going to get annoying, and I don't find it's personally that annoying. Show values when adjusting your controls as well. If you hover over, say, this here, or maybe something like the something like the unison here, or the polyphony, should I say, it will show the value. Again, if you do this with the unison blend, you see the 72, 73, 71, 70, 67. Leaving this on will show that. If you don't want that, you can have it off if you prefer. I like to see the values personally. So when this limit mod depth on drop is turned on, which you do want it on generally speaking, when you drag a new LFO onto anything, it basically means that the movement, no matter where this central point is never going to go above. It's going to limit it at the end of the knob value. So you can see that little red marker there. If I turn this off, I believe the red marker goes away. It may not. No, it does stay there. But it basically does mean that the movement of this LFO, it's going to keep it there. It's not going to, can't go past it. So it's just helpful to see where it ends. Very cool. Silence, note, and effect tails means that when I'm playing in my DAW, so if I have my DAW transport on there, I add some reverb, let's say. Some really long reverb. Right? And I press stop. Now those note tails, all those reverb tails, including releases, by the way, this isn't just reverb, will stop, which is cool because sometimes you don't want a 7-second reverb tail going on after you press stop on your DAW. Double clicking on any knob allows you to type in a value. So if I wanted to say 0 degrees this, I could just double click on phase and do that, or I can go back to 180, which is the default. Very handy. Or I could use double click to reset a control. So if I do that there, it means that I won't be able to type in a value. It means it'll just reset it. I don't like to use that because I believe you can just control or command click if you're on Mac, the phase knob, and that goes back to 0. So I prefer to do that. That goes for any knob, not just the phase knob. So you can have that on if you prefer. I don't like to have it open. Mod wheel are a wavetable position when the Wavetable Editor is open. Now, we'll get to the Wavetable Editor at the end of this course because this is a very helpful thing to have on when you're creating your own wavetables from scratch. So it's not going to apply when you're just in a normal synth here. It'll only apply when this Wavetable Editor is open, where this will actually cycle through the thing, which we'll get to in a sec. So leave that on. Disable mouse wheel params. So basically, you have to reopen this for it to take effect. But if I wanted to not make it so that my mouse wheel changes knobs like it is now, I'm just using my mouse wheel, not clicking and dragging, I could disable that there if I wanted to. Again, I'd have to close Serum and reopen it for it to take effect. MPE enabled by default. MPE is MIDI polyphonic expression. Basically, this is certain synths, or should I say certain MIDI keyboards, have certain expression parameters. For example, how hard you hold the note down when you're playing it, whether you move up and down the note to create pitch slide effects. The Rolly C board here is a really good example of an MPE device. This is an extra layer of expression that you can map to things. So by default, it's disabled in Serum, but you can enable it there. And then when you enable it, you'll see, I think, MPE parameters X, Y, and Z show up in your modulation sources. I don't believe there's a visual way they show up here. So that's just something to know. If you do want to use MPE, you just have to click it on there. Then this is a really good feature. I think it's relatively new, but it's ask before preset change on edited presets. So if I make a patch from scratch or load up one and make changes to it, if I swap to a new preset, it will ask me this. Are you sure you want to load a new one? I don't in this case, so I'm going to press cancel. But if you have that off, it will just change. So you will lose your progress if you were designing a sound and accidentally change synths or presets. This was a later feature to be added because people were complaining that they would actually do that and then they would lose all their work. So very, very helpful. Thanks, Steve, on that one. That's all the preferences there. Few last things here. We've got the oscillator settings. By default, they're on ×2 quality. ×1 is good if your CPU is struggling. It's more of a draft mode, and then you would switch to a higher one later down the track. Then ×4 is the highest possible quality you could have from Serum. This is the amount of oversampling. In most cases, I honestly find ×2 to be sufficient, but maybe you find ×4 does make a difference, and you can use that. You can also lock the quality based on the preset. For example, if I click lock here and you hover over it, the oversampling settings remain between presets, but this is a setting that will be locked, will be saved in each preset. So if you set ×4 and then save the preset, Serum will remember that when you load it up next time, which is very good to know. You got noise fine control, which is what I was talking about here. When in the matrix, you have the option to modulate the noise fine, but you don't see it there. For some reason, it's been put here in the oscillator settings. People have mentioned wanting it in the oscillator section here, but we don't have it yet. You've also got the ability to set what your A tuning is, which is whether you want it to be standard Western 440 or whether you want it to be 432 or something completely different all over from that. So that's a way you want to change that. I don't, again, do this a lot. This will adjust all the tunings of all the notes based on this A value. And then you can also load up a tuning file here. If you click on it, it will give you the option to load up a custom tuning file, for example, for microtonal music. Not something I use a lot, but if you are into that stuff, use this here. I haven't checked whether Ableton 12's new tunings will work with that. You could try and navigate to, say, your user library, which is in my Ableton here, user library. Let's see if we can find tunings. Don't think we have them in here. No, doesn't look like it. So someone can correct me in the comments there if I am wrong. But yeah, you can download third-party tuning files and load them up here. We've also got the version and date it was created. So if you need that information at any point, you can see that down here. Great, and that is pretty much it for the global settings. Very helpful to know for certain different use cases. We're just going to cover off a few more menu settings we didn't get a chance to cover off last time. And then we're going to go and talk about the preset settings, as the preset menu there. There's a few MPE things here as well, where you can enable MPE from the menu. This is another way of basically enabling it here, but the difference is by default, when you load this up, this will be checked. So you have to enable it here and then enable it in the menu here, which is a bit of a weird two-step process, but it is what it is. You can map default XYZ mappings, which is going to be different for every MPE device, to macro 1, 2, and 3, 1 and 2 to macros Y and Z to macro 1 and 2 rather, and then Y to the mod wheel. Again, this is just different movements. You can then also change the MPE bend range, which is different to the normal pitch wheel you've got. This is for the actual note bending per note, which allows you to individually move each note when you're playing different ones rather than all of those notes moving at the same time like the pitch wheel does. This allows you to select a 48 semitone pitch bend range, which is great if you just want these crazy pitch effects. Again, you need to have an MPE device for all this to work though, so that's just a quick word on that. Now, a few other things here. You can lock effect tracks, load effect chains, and save effect chains. So we're going back to the effects here. If you say want to lock the effect track between changing presets, this will keep just the reverb in no matter which preset you have loaded up. And this is great, again, for getting experimental sound design results, because locking the effect track and changing presets can often yield unexpected results that you didn't get. You can also load an entire effect chain preset just for this section from here, and also save the whole chain here. So if I just wanted this reverb saved, I could do that. Of course, we did cover saving individual effects like just the reverb, but this allows you to do it for the entire effects unit, which is really, really cool. We did kind of talk about loading tuning files. This is another way to do it here. MIDI maps and saving MIDI maps is where you have your keyboard mapped to certain parameters. Something handy. I'm not going to go too deep into that because it's only for certain use cases. I'm sure you'll find a more in-depth YouTube video for your particular MIDI controller if you're wanting to set that up with Serum. And that's pretty much all of the menu settings that we didn't cover originally. Now we're lastly just going to go into the presets menu. Now we already talked about this a bit. What we didn't talk about though is this menu here, which basically is just a few ways you can work with presets and there's some really, really cool ways to do this. So for example, if I select a preset here, I can show this in my Finder, which will open it up on my computer. Helpful to know, especially if it's like a third-party one and you're wanting to move it around. You can load up a random preset. I'm not going to do this because I've already got one I've created loaded up, but if you wanted to, you can go ahead and do that very quickly. Hybridize is 8. And by the way, these have different number shortcuts as denoted by those square brackets, so you can use those as well. Hybridize basically will take the presets you've got selected and create a new preset. Now, I am going to do this. So I'm going to go ahead here and select 3 different presets. Or actually, I can only select one at a time. I'm going to load this in, but I'm actually going to go here. I'm going to hybridize it. So it's just picked 3 presets based on what's been filtered here, by the way. And it's just created a new sound for me, which is super sick for just random sound design. I'm going to press it again. New sound, hybridize again. New sound. And again, if you filter, you can actually then hybridize just with these ones. Bit loud. Gonna turn that down. Again, we could do it. See what happens. Nothing this time. Sometimes you do get nothing. Like that's some crazy sound design there, right? And you can also search. So if I went like DS or something here, I can see all of the patches with the word DS in it, and then I can hybridize those together, which is very, very cool. And then I can hybridize favoring the selected preset. So if I want one that sounds like this preset, but just a little bit different, I can use this version, which is just going to make it slightly different. It's kind of similar in sound design, right? That one's quite different, but it just gives you different opportunities. Lots of fun. Then you've got some basic controls where you can rescan the database if you've loaded new presets in. You can erase and rebuild the database, which is like just basically delete all the information you've added in. So if you've added, say, categories to your own presets or whatever, it will erase all that information. You can prune duplicates and missing presets, which is going to remove presets that are in the folders twice. Good if you've got way too many copies of something for the same reason. You can change the filter by location, or you can change the filter by category. Sometimes it's nice to do by location if you're using third-party presets and you're using your own folders, like I am here. For example, I could remove this filter just kind of go to my Splice Future Bass folder, and then I could also, find one in here that I like as a starting point. Then I could hybridize this, favoring that one. Get something different, which is pretty cool. Then you've got the ability to change the fourth column here, whether it's the date, author, description, or comment. I mean, a lot of them don't have descriptions and comments. I mean, except the description is just this thing up here. You'll see, which you can double click and rename. This is the author. This is the description. I don't find it particularly helpful to use this. I mean, if you did want to, you could leave comments and do that. I just like to leave it as the date. I mean, it probably would be good to have the author there. Maybe. I don't really know. Then you've also got the ability to rate presets, which is pretty cool. So you could give your favorite presets different star ratings, which is pretty cool. You can't, unfortunately, filter by rating, which is something that's a bit annoying, but it is what it is. And so that's a few extra features there you can use in the preset window. Okay, so now we go to the beast, the belly of the beast, which is the Wavetable Editor. So you get there, again, by clicking this little pencil icon in either oscillator A or B. Doesn't work with the other two oscillators. And you get this view, which looks really complicated and confusing. In a sense it is, but at the same time, once you understand a few of the basic ways this works, it becomes a lot more simple to understand. So this view of the waveform here in the middle and this view at the top are the same thing. It's just different ways of showing the same thing, if that makes sense. And in fact, any changes you make down here in the wavetable view, you can actually just press this blue button, which is the wave to FFT, which will convert whatever you're doing into this up here. So you can actually then edit the wavetable in this view here. Now, why on earth would you want to edit, one over the other? Well, there are different benefits to, say, creating a wavetable down here and one up here. I find the best workflow is to design your wave shape down here and then adjust things up here to kind of make it more fine-tuned to the way you want it to sound. Now, in this case, I'm going to actually initialize this preset here so we can hear this applied to a basic saw wave, right? It's probably the easiest way to demonstrate it. Now, we have this basic saw wave, which you can see every one of these green lines is filled in at the top here. Now, this is referred to as a bin. These are the different harmonics in a wavetable. And a saw wave is notorious for having pretty much every single one to a little extent. Right. This one below it, these bins here, these are the phase bins. So basically, each of the harmonics will be offset from a different position. So for example, if I move this one, you'll see the waveform actually doesn't sound that different, but it looks different, right? Now, a lot of subtle movements on these phases will add up to make a difference. Even though they're technically the exact same frequencies, it's the way that they're interacting with one another, right? It's a very interesting result you can get. Now, I like to kind of, again, play around with both to kind of emphasize, say, the main one here, which is the main fundamental. The louder this is, the more of that main tone you're going to hear. Right, and then you got different harmonics like bin 3. Emphasizing these odd ones is going to get you sort of a hollow square-like tone. As you can see, that has made it more into a square wave, which is pretty interesting. And so on and so forth. Now, this isn't going to be a technical sound design tutorial on how to use these to make specific sounds, but it is how you would use them if you were to. Now, on the left-hand side here, you've got different shape selectors, which allows you to draw in different types of shapes. So, for example, if I can select this ramp up, I can select this ramp down, I can select a sine wave, and so on and so forth, which is pretty handy for different shapes. There's sort of like curved lineups, curved line down and back up, down, line down. Then you've got more of this like shaper sort of control, which is going to draw a straight line between all of the different points, which is good for kind of creating a more consistent waveform. Quite helpful. This is the same one here, but it makes it into a curved line, which curved lines generally sound a bit smoother than jagged straight lines. For example, bit harsher with the straight line there. This one here allows you to move the different grids around just to get different textures. Often square-like textures like this sound a bit digital and kind of clippy, for lack of a better term. Then you've got a noise generator, which is noise, right? So it's very complex harmonically. You can see here there's lots of crazy lines going everywhere. Now, if you adjust the grid size here, for example, if we put it on 1 and 1, like so, I could just, bam, draw in a straight sine wave, or bam, draw this straight in. Very helpful to know. And yeah, the grid size is going to determine what you can do here. Lots of fun sound design possibilities with that too. I do find adjusting the horizontal grid, but leaving this on 1 is a good way to do that. You can also kind of just move things around with this little arrow one. So for example, if I change the grid, on 0 grid, we have complete freeform, which is really helpful. Great for low tones, this one. There's some cool sound design possibility in there. So this is like the draw mirror as well. So any draws I make on one side will apply on the other side. So if I get like a sine wave, for example, and do sort of like some fast random movements like this. Oh, yeah, that's going to be some cool results. Oh, yeah. Turn off this and just use normal sine too. I find sines are really fun to play with on this 0 grid option, because you can get some really cool basic tones that you can then distort and do whatever to. Oof, that's nice and nasty. Okay, that is the main controls there. Now, there's a few other ways you can adjust what's going on here as well. We're not going to go over that for now, but it is something you can do nonetheless. Now, you've got a few ways to process this wavetable. So there's the single menu, which is going to select the current frame. Now, before we understand what current frame even means, we have to talk about this bottom view here. Now, in Serum, a wavetable can have up to 256 frames. Currently, we've got 1 frame. So if I wanted to add a second one, I would just click this plus button and then bam, I have 2 different ones I can control. This is the second, this is the first. And again, I can use that wavetable position on my mod wheel to move between them there like we covered earlier. I can add or remove frames here as well if I want to, and I can easily select different frames from this view here, the total amount of frames being at the end there, which is very helpful. I can copy and paste frames. So for example, if I wanted to copy frame 1 to frame 3, I can do that there, very helpful. I can undo changes and redo them and whatnot. Now, the currently selected frame will have this blue icon and this little gray arrow on it, very helpful to know. Now, you may not want to have to go ahead here and add, say, 300 or 256 frames. So how the heck are you going to get a smooth morph between these different frames like some presets have? I don't want it to just snap between them. Well, this is where the different modes up here come into play. I'm actually going to remove the third one here. We're just going to have 2 frames to begin with, and we're going to shift select both of them, which is what you can do with allowing that blue rectangle to come around. We'll cover that in a second. Now, before we do that, I'm going to go back to the first frame here. You can normalize a frame. So for example, if it's not at the top and bottom points maximum, you can normalize it. This one is, so it's not going to look any different. That makes it as loud as it possibly can go. If your wavetable's too quiet, can be really helpful. You can remove DC offset, which some wavetables have sort of this skew. This is especially the case if you draw in like a sine wave up here or something like this. I'm going to go up to 2 here, right? Or maybe this. Why is that not going up? There we go. So for example, this would normalize it, right? Let's go to 3 grid maybe. That actually nudges the amplitude. Sorry, I forgot to mention this. This actually nudges the amplitude. This nudges the movement of the actual wavetable, which is something that's good to know. So if we have like this, right? If I click remove DC offset, it's going to put it in the middle, right? Which is very helpful if you've got a wave that's just not where you want it to be. It's not at that zero crossing, which is good, so your wavetable doesn't have any mix issues. You can reverse the polarity, so it flips upside down vertically or horizontally, which is cool for certain effects. You can shift the horizontal to the zero crossing, so bam, that's just going to make sure that the whole wavetable is in the middle. Very helpful. You can initialize it, go to silence if you wanted to. You have a wave in there. You can fade the edges so that it's smooth and kind of starts at 0 on both sides. You can crossfade them so it's even smoother. You can filter the wavetable so it's like basically whatever the grid size is here, it will kind of smooth it out, which is very handy. So for example, if we have like a really complex wavetable here and we filter it, it's going to filter it down to that, which makes it really simple looking, but very helpful. But if we had a grid like this, for example, we can filter it and it'll be smoother, but not quite as smooth. Very helpful. Okay, we're going to normalize that there. This is where all of these come into play. Sample Redux at grid size is going to squarify the wave like this. It kind of does it somewhat related to how big the grid size is. The other cool thing that is here, which I don't know how new this feature is, but Send to Noise Oscillator will basically send the output of this wavetable to the noise oscillator if you want to treat it sort of as a third wavetable. Pretty cool. And then I think you can also use the phase option to move it through it like a wavetable position. Someone correct me if I'm wrong there. And that's the single waveform processors. Now, for example, we talked about how would we blend these two together? Well, you can select a bunch of wavetables and process them all individually. This will adjust them all so they all have sort of a similarity to them. So this is not for single. So for example, you could filter them all to the same grid size. Very helpful there. That's going to smooth that one out sort of. A lot of the controls will be very similar. You can normalize each of them, normalize them all the same. So they're all the same loudness. Normalize each will remove any volume differences between the wavetable, which you may or may not want. Got remove DC offset, flip horizontal vertical, fading, filter. Remove fundamental is a very crazy one to sort of like remove the tone of the sound, which is sometimes what you want. Sounds like this. Notice that bin 1 is now gone. It does it on all the oscillators there, all the wavetable frames. So we don't want that though. I want to add it back in. Very helpful to know it is there. You can remove the low spectrals and phases. So boom, that's going to reset all the phases back to 0 position, or you can remove everything, which is sometimes what you want. Okay, we're going to go back to here, and we've got sample redux at grid size again. You got resize tables to be half. So for example, if I wanted to split each wavetable between 2 frames, that's really cool to do that. Which is good if you've got like a high-pitched sounding wavetable. You've got like double, which is the opposite way. Create PWM from this table to all, which will kind of create this 256 frame movement of the wavetable. Again, a bit of a weird one. I don't really use that a lot. Nudge all the phases for fundamental to 50%. This one here is, as you'll see, kind of moves this one to 0 and makes it all aligned visually to whatever the fundamental is being at 0. And it will do that for all the wavetables so that 0 fundamental, bin 1 here, will have 0 phase. Very helpful to know. You've got set spectral and phases from other oscillators. This is just going to move the spectrum or the phases based on those settings. Again, sometimes it's just good to play around with these and see what happens. Sometimes nothing will happen like there. This will move the phases of each oscillator to a different one there. So for example, this has just moved this one. So it's actually the same, as you can see, same frequencies, but it's just moved the phases around. Right? Very similar sounds, but those phase differences do make a difference. You can subtract the spectrum from the other oscillator. This is oscillator B, of course. In this case, it will do nothing because there's nothing there. Let's undo that. And then you've got a few other ones. Blur spectra, blur phases, adjacent frames and bins. Again, just play around with these. They sometimes get a smoother result. Just so it makes it more smooth. Again, this is all just part of the process of sound design. Then you've got that option to shift the horizontal to the 0 crossing again, which will do it for all these individual ones, which is cool. But we really want to talk about the morph settings here. So the morph settings are the ability to fade between these two waveforms in a smooth way. Right now, we just have two frames that kind of jump between them. If we use a crossfade, we can get a different result. Now you'll see here there's only 2 frames still, but one is at 256. So this will now smoothly morph between the two there, and you can see that movement. Now that's one mode of morphing. You've also got spectrum morphing, which is similar but different. It more moves the spectrum itself. You can do spectral 0 fundamental phase. Slightly different movement there. You've got this spectral all 0 phases. So again, slightly different movement. It's going to 0 the fundamental phase. Again, no phase there. It's going to 0 all the phases actually. And then you've got this movement, which in this case will be nothing because this one doesn't have anything. So we might have to like do something, interesting, like shift horizontal to 0 crossing. And then we'd have to add a spectrum morph. Get a new result, right? Very cool. And you've got remove morph tables if you don't want to add them. So you go back to just the standard 2 frames. Very helpful to add smooth movement. So for example, I could add in a nice sine wavy sort of thing here. We're going to go remove DC offset. Then I'm going to do a similar thing here. And I'm going to remove the DC offset here. Again, that'll do it on all of them. And then we could morph crossfade. Now we're getting some really sick results. One thing I just thought of that could be really, really cool is to resize the tables to be half. Ooh, now I'm going to do that again to go even lower. Ooh. And then this is where you get some really sick results, right? Very, very, very cool. You could, blur the spectra if you wanted to. Sort of adjusts it all. And actually that setting there will create all of those frames individually, which is interesting to know. Some really cool movements on there with the mod wheel. You can then have these add remove settings. So for example, you can initialize all the frames if you wanted to. I'm not going to do that in this case. You can insert a new frame at your current index, wherever your selection is down here, similar to how this one does it. You can remove the current index, similar to how the minus does it. You can remove multiple if you've selected multiple. You can remove everything from the beginning to the selected, which in this case would remove everything up to 11. You can remove everything from this one to the end, which would remove 11 up to 256. You can remove all frames, or you can just reduce to, say, 4 frames, which would then have the same movement, but we're only seeing 4 solid frames that we can edit, which is helpful sometimes for workflow purposes because 256 individual frames is a lot to work with. So I actually used that one quite a bit there, reduce to. You can then sort these frames by different things. So for example, the movement, it might not be perfect, but you like the actual frames. We can then sort these frames by different ways. So for example, peak spectrum, that kind of makes, the different parts of the spectrum at different points. You got the average spectrum, kind of gets louder over time. You got peak amount, which is more cleanly, the loudest peak per frame. You've got number with spectrum. Again, at this point, I'm just kind of play around with these to see what's cool. They're all going to be different result. And then fundamental amount sometimes is nice if you want to go from a thinner sound to a more solid body full sound. You can see here, watch bin 1. It's going to go from the lowest amount of fundamental to the top. Very helpful. You can randomize it for cool random effects, and then you can reverse the entire order. Very helpful. Then import audio, which I'll get to in a second. This allows you to do it from a direct file. So you select an audio file to bring in. The other way you can do this though is if you have an audio file, is you can also just bring it in here and drag it directly on. Now the settings are the same in both, whether you import it via these settings or you import it by clicking and dragging. These all have different ways of working though. So we've already kind of talked about the different ways these work, so we'll leave that again for now, but it's the same settings. Audio to single cycle is the one that I don't think actually shows up though when you hover over that. This will basically put that audio file in one frame. So if I select, say, a random bit of audio, maybe something on my desktop, boom, it's going to put this entire track, which was an entire song, into one frame. Not exactly the most useful way to use that setting, but hey, it's helpful to play around with, and sometimes you get some cool results. So yeah, feel free to use those. And you can export the wavetable as an actual file, whether it's an 8-bit 256 file, a wave file of 16 or 32-bit. You could export all as individual single wave files if you don't want it to be like a wavetable with movement, or you can just export a certain selection of the frames to a wave file. So very helpful if you're wanting to sort of share wavetables with other people or have your own preset library of wavetables to come back to, which I like. And that is the menus there. There's a lot of stuff going on, and we haven't even fully scratched the surface yet. One thing I wanted to mention is you notice these gray lines here. These are kind of the main harmonic intervals that you're wanting to make sure are pretty solid in a lot of sounds, because that's where a lot of the main sort of tone comes from. So when you're designing wavetables, pay attention to how much of each frequency is there at those individual bins. Okay, so a few other things we have to talk about. We have to talk about this formula parser here. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't use this a whole lot. It does require you to kind of learn the way that it works. It's like basically a whole other skill set. If you are into maths and you'd like to design your own wavetables with maths, you can enter your own formula parsers here. You can actually go to the manual and see the syntax for how to put it into this parser as well. For example, I've just loaded one up here and this is the formula. Pretty crazy. Again, up to you if you want to do it. What I do like to use this for is the presets. So you've got single presets, which is for an individual frame, or you've got multi presets, which is for all frames. So for example, I can go and select one here, like Sine Overdrive. Move the wavetable there, and bam, we've got a really sick movement. And that will show the new formula there. So if you want to go and edit it, you can, or you can do an individual frame. So for example, if I just wanted to change this sine to a normal sine, I can go ahead and do that there as well. Very, very helpful. There are the ability to save your own user singles and multis in the folder as well. Again, refer to the manual for how to do that, but it's very helpful. Again, I just like to use the multis as a starting point. You do also have these cool process multis, which doesn't really replace the preset, but it kind of processes what is already there. So for example, this squarify option kind of turns everything into more of a square wave. Now in this case, it already is a square wave. So I'm actually going to put something in, maybe like harmonic sync. I'm going to put squarify on that. This kind of changes the texture of it a bit there, which I think is really sick. You could do that on wacky. It's like a kick drum sort of one. Let's do squarify. Really sick. So use these processes with the PROC colon at the bottom there to kind of get some cool results. Again, we'll just select a new one. And then we can go squarify, maybe alt. Ooh, that's really interesting. And then we can maybe normalize each. There's kind of really sick like gaps between some of them. So you get some like sort of stuttery, glitchy effects in there. This is the power of making your own wavetables, by the way. Super powerful stuff. And that is pretty much it for the Wavetable Editor. A few other things. You've got the ability to switch between oscillator A and B. You've got the zoom for the FFT view up here, so you can go to anything and see either a lot of the frequencies or none of them, depending on what you're wanting to go for. Probably easier if we load in something with a bit more harmonic content, so you can sort of see, you know, different parts of it there, which is cool. And that is pretty much it. You can also repeat actions, so anything you do, you can redo it over and over again to sort of get different results in the oscillator. So feel free to go nuts with that. And with that, that is the end of this huge 3-hour course. So I really hope this provided you with a holistic, in-depth understanding of how Serum works, so that you can leave this tutorial, this course, and go and make your own sounds, knowing exactly what you're doing. Feel free to come back and refer to this video as many times as you need, bookmark it in your browser. And remember, go check out our free EDMProd EDM Essentials Serum preset pack to grab some great sounds to begin with, tweak them using the knowledge you've just learned, and make some really cool original sounds. With that, next up, I'd recommend watching this video on some Serum-based design tips. If that's your thing, you'll find some of these really helpful. So I'll see you there. Until next time, happy producing.